person had appeared ahead of them. However, it was really very difficult to use the word person to describe him. He could only be considered a human-like figure. His body was covered with sharp spikes of varying width, some thinner and some thicker, appearing very bizarre. These spikes were completely unlike adornments, but rather seemed to be growing directly from his body, and looked very natural. Ling Han and his group were surprised. This human figure had to be a being of the Three Blooms Valley. Otherwise, they definitely had not seen such a monster come in with them, and one that had managed to rush ahead of them at that. This place was actually capable of nurturing living beings? They did not hear Yen Xianlu speak of this. Ling Han did not think that Yen Xianlu would deliberately hide this kind of information. Of course, it was also impossible that the Eternal Prosperity Celestial King had deliberately concealed it from his beloved disciple. Then, there was only one reason, and that was this monster had been birthed only in the last 100 million years. It could be tens of millions years ago or hundreds of thousands of years ago. In fact, it could even be as recently as 3 to 5 days ago. How could the mysterious and profound nature of nature be easily guessed? And whom are the war drums made for? This human-like monster continued, his voice very low. Accompanied by the tone that he was using, he seemed like an old soldier that had lived through many battles, relating his reflective thoughts of war. Stupid monster. Why are you acting all mysterious? Isn't it just because you want to fight? Come, Nyo will oblige. Hunyo called out loudly, but before the human-like monster made a move, the Empress had already charged out. Boom! She shot out a punch, and Sword Chi danced madly. Wayaya, you are so despicable. This is Nyo's. Hunyo stomped in fury, and charged out as well, attacking that human-like monster. Now that she had made a move, the strength of the human-like monster was clear to see. Yang Soul. Against severing mundane tier, this should be completely one-sided. Unfortunately, whether it was the Empress or Hunyo, neither of them were ordinary severing mundane tier, but rather fifth severance monarch tiers. In terms of cultivation level, they were equivalent to Yang Soul, and in terms of battle prowess, they could still be invincible in a battle against an opponent that was one cultivation level higher than them, which also meant that they could defeat even Yin Soul elites. Under the combined forces of these two women, how was this human-like monster supposed to resist? Pung, pung, pung. In a chaotic tussle, he was very quickly beaten up. What was strange was the fact that this human-like monster did not have a body. Under the masses of spikes, the body was actually empty. There was only a crimson stone that was like its heart. However, it was only as big as a segment of a pinky. Why do you have to fight with Nyo? Hunyo was not willing to give up the matter, and glared at the Empress. The Empress, meanwhile, couldn't be bothered to give her any regard, looking like she was treating her like a child, so she would not lower herself to Hunyo's level. Despicable witch! Hunyo stomped in fury, clinging onto the Empress tirelessly. She was determined to get a reply. There were times when she was really very obstinate. Ling Han, meanwhile, picked up that crimson stone. However, his hand had just touched it when a boundless red immediately surged out in his mind. Shadows of swords and blades presented a complete massacre. He immediately showed an expression of shock, and exclaimed, "Regulation of slaughter!" The Black Tower also contained regulation of slaughter, and he had attained a superficial comprehension thereof, so he was not the slightest bit unfamiliar with this regulation of slaughter. The Empress was immediately interested, and came closer to see. Hey! Which, you haven't said why you have to fight with Nyo yet? Hunyo said, unrelenting. Regulation of slaughter? Bewitching Maiden Row also approached, similarly filled with interest. You're saying that this contains the regulation of slaughter? The regulation of slaughter was outside of the 5 elements and lightning. Usually, there would completely be no chance to study it, so it was incredibly precious. Ling Han glared at her and retorted, "Even if there is, it's none of your business." Bewitching Maiden Row was irritated. This unromantic rude boor, she really wanted to strangle him. Ling Han tossed the stone to the Empress. He had the Black Tower and could study the regulation of slaughter at any time, so he did not need this kind of thing. the Empress would naturally not act reserved with him, and put the blood-colored stone away. Bewitching Maiden Ro pouted slightly. She too wanted it, but Ling Han didn't even bother to ask her. He really was despicable. Which Nyo is speaking to you? Hunyo was abruptly still unwilling to give up. With Hunyo constantly pressing for an answer, they walked ahead for about 2 to 3 miles, and another human-like monster covered completely with sharp spikes appeared again. Hunyo screamed, and hurriedly made the first move to attack. Very soon she killed this monster. As expected, the sharp spikes fell, and it was completely empty inside, except for a small stone that was as red as blood. It's still regulation of slaughter. Ling Han nodded, and then tossed the stone over to the Empress again. Because the valley had become completely even here, and there was nothing resembling a path, but it had rather become a massive plain. They were like stones that been thrown into the ocean, not creating even the slightest ripple. Everyone would definitely have chosen a different direction, and after walking for an extended distance, this difference would be huge. Thus, Ling Han and his group did not catch up to the people ahead of them, nor were they surpassed by those behind them. Whether they were still in the lead or had fallen behind, they had completely no idea. Who? 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 A strange animal sound rang out, and a weird demonic beast appeared ahead of them. From the looks of it, it should be a hog, but it was similarly covered with sharp spikes, which instantly made its size double, giving off a twisted feeling of pressure. I'll go. Bewitching Maiden Ro was the first to move. If this monster was still killed by Ling Han, the Empress, or Hunyo, she would not be able to bring herself to ask for a share of the precious gems that contained the regulation of slaughter. But if she took the initiative to attack first, then even if she would only be watching from the sidelines for the rest of the battle, she could still bring herself to shamelessly ask for a share of the loot later, right? She moved directly. Her slender hand shook, and a wooden sword appeared in her hands, which she slashed out towards the blade hog. Xiao, sword chi surged out, turning into a brilliant light. This strike was struck on the blade hog, but not even a single spike had been severed. Instead, it made this blade hog focus on her, and a murderous aura instantly surged over. Bewitching Maiden Ro's beautiful face paled, and she almost passed out. This was regulation of slaughter, which was incredibly frightening. Even Ling Han's expression changed immediately, and he exclaimed, "Not good! This thing is Earth soul level." Hong long long. The blade hog charged towards Ling Han and his group in a flurry of its hooves. Come, let's give it a try. Ling Han's fighting spirit was ignited, and he greeted it with a punch. Pong! Ling Han was immediately sent flying, so fast that his figure was like a cannonball that had been shot. Ling Han had been sent flying for close to several hundred miles before he finally managed to slow himself down. He saw that the part of his robes covering his abdomen had been torn, revealing a circular wound, and traces of blood had also appeared on his abdomen. He had actually suffered injury from this blow. Earth soul-level battle prowess was indeed terrifying. Ling Han rubbed his abdomen and gritted his teeth, as expected of regulation of slaughter. Otherwise, merely Earth soul alone would not have been able to damage his physical body so easily. This little injury was not enough to drive him into a breakdown, but the problem was that his attack was far inferior to his defense. Fighting with this blade hog only meant that he would be barraged with attacks, so what was the point? Flee? Hide into the Black Tower? Ling Han shook his head. In a motion of space teleportation, he instantly appeared in front of that blade hog. He drew the divine demon sword and delivered a strike. Wang. Majestic light unleashed in all directions as sword chi filled the skies. The blade hog naturally would not be afraid. With a shake of its body, countless spikes shot out, blasting towards Ling Han. In that short instant, this blade hog had turned into a naked hog. Ling Han stretched out a hand and lightly said, "Time stop!" Wang, whether it was the blade hog or the spikes and blades that were filling the skies, they all entered into a paused condition at the same time. This was not Ling Han's ability, but rather the Black Tower's might. When the flow of time slowed down to the maximum, the result was immobility. Shua, the divine demon sword swept out, and with a pu, A high-quality hog's head flew skywards out of nowhere. However, it instantly vanished, and the body of the hog also collapsed, similarly breaking into bits and pieces, and leaving behind only a single stone as red as blood. Hoo. Ling Han used the divine demon's sword like a cane, continuously panting, his expression very ugly. The price for using this move was too massive, exhausting him completely. It was not only his origin power, but also his soul. His whole person seemed to have become a blank piece of paper, where the only thing remaining was emptiness. He could use time acceleration and deceleration as he liked, but the more serious the effects and the wider the range, the more it would take out of him. This apex immobility of time made Ling Han directly lose all ability to continue battle. Furthermore, this move could only be used once a month in real time. It was useless even if he went into the time cultivation chamber. The Black Tower would need to draw out a certain energy from real space. Ling Han, you are so awesome! Hunyo immediately pounced. You managed to kill even an Earth Soul level monster with a single move. So awesome. So great. Nyo wants to have kids with you. Everything the little girl said was all for the sake of the last line. Yet Ling Han was only willing to embrace her and kiss her, which made Nyo very displeased. Ling Han was immediately pushed down by Hunyo. At this point, he did not have the slightest bit of strength left. Hunyo giggled and planted kisses on Ling Han's face non-stop. Not only did she kiss him, she also licked and bit him, acting very much like a little kitten. Meanwhile, bewitching Maiden Ro was incredibly stunned. That creature just now was an Earth Soul level monster? And Ling Han had actually killed it with a single strike? Just how strong was he? Yet she did not know that this was not Ling Han's own battle prowess, but rather the might of the Black Tower. Could only be used once a month, and had almost drained Ling Han completely. If there were a few more enemies, that would only be a suicidal action. However, this time she could shamelessly pick up that blood-colored stone. But the moment she moved, she saw that the Empress grabbed the stone in her hand with a wave of her hand. "Sister," she called out plaintively. The Empress swept a stern eye on her and said, "I have my own plans on the allocation." "Oh!" Bewitching Maiden Ro twiddled her fingers. In front of the Empress, she would not have the slightest temper. "Girlie, get up." Ling Han was almost suffocated by Hunyo's kisses. Yet the other two women did not seem like they had any intention of giving him a hand. Hunyo giggled and said, "Let's have babies." This was constantly in her mind. Ling Han began to lecture her righteously again, and took out a considerable amount of food before the little girl temporarily forgot about the matter of having babies. He recovered some energy, and finally could stand up and walk around. What stone is this exactly? It actually contains a sliver of regulation of slaughter. Ling Han had the Empress take out all the blood-colored stones. The stone that represented the Earth Soul monster was very clearly much larger. "This is Celestial King Bloodstone." Small Tower suddenly spoke up. In an intense Celestial King tier battle, blood splatters on the ground, and these stones have been stained with a sliver of Celestial King tier blood, yet had not shattered. After countless years of development, a strange change has taken place, Small Tower explained. Realization dawned on Ling Han. No wonder there had been strange human-like creatures and demonic beasts, but when they were killed, there was no actual body. As it turned out, the root of everything was the blood that had been left behind by the Celestial King. As expected of a Celestial King, he had merely spilled a little blood, yet after countless years it could actually result in such a shocking mutation. Then this Celestial King must have cultivated the regulation of slaughter, he surmised resolutely. At least 7th Heaven Celestial King. Small Tower also made its own deduction. It looked like the rumors were not false. A great many natural mystery realms had been the battlegrounds that had been left behind after Celestial Kings battled, and contained the immortal and ageless will of the Celestial King. After countless years of development, the power of heaven and earth would also be added in, so it would become a natural mystery realm. Ling Han nodded and said to the Empress, "Put them away. Looks like we should be able to encounter more of such monsters, and collect even more Celestial King bloodstones." He roughly outlined Small Tower's words to them. Ordinarily, one could only cultivate the regulations of the 5 elements and lightning, while other regulations could only be gained through specific celestial medicine or certain unusual treasures. However, these regulations were more powerful, and could be maintained until right before Celestial King tier. Hence, the value of these Celestial King bloodstones was extraordinarily high. From a different perspective, the value of the Black Tower was what was truly astounding. It actually contained the 3 regulations of slaughter, time, and space. If Ling Han comprehended these regulations, and was still unable to become an emperor that destroyed all his peers, then he really would be trash. The 4 of them continued on their way, and very soon, they encountered another human-like monster. Hunyo and the Empress rushed forward together, and dealt with it quickly. But subsequently they encountered a great dilemma. Another beast-like monster appeared, having Earth's soul-level battle prowess, and chasing Ling Han and his group to scramble everywhere. Thankfully, this monster seemed to have a specific range of activity. After they left this range, this monster would also stop and no longer pursue them. The 4 of them exchanged looks, and suddenly broke out into laughter. In a battle of equals, they had never been chased everywhere by their opponents. This was a very novel experience. After we break through to the dividing soul tier, we will be able to beat these monsters easily. Ling Han rubbed his nose. It was unfortunate that time stop could only be used once a month. Otherwise, there would have been no need for him to run. However, after we break through to the dividing soul tier, we won't be able to enter this place anymore, the Empress said. Nyo can, Hunyo exclaimed, raising her hand. Nyo also has a great ultimate move, and killing these monsters would be as easy as slaughtering chickens. How frequently can you use it? Ling Han asked. Once every 3 months. Hunyo raised 3 fingers. Ling Han nodded, and said, Don't waste it on these minor characters. Unless in a life-or-death situation, don't use it. This is to be used to save your life. Okay, Nyo knows. Hunyo nodded obediently. They continued to go deeper, and when they encountered Yang Soul and Yin Soul monsters, they would move to kill them. If their opponent was Earth Soul level, they could only break into a run and flee. After these several times, they had also diverted from their original course, but it could be confirmed that they were still heading to the depths of the valley because those 3 peaks were there as their guide, so they couldn't possibly have lost their way. This valley was astonishingly huge, and they weren't able to use movement techniques to sprint at full speed ahead either. Thus, their speed of traveling was naturally not going to be fast. A whole 3 months had passed, and they still hadn't made it to the middle. That was because they still hadn't reached the foot of the 3 peaks. This would be the sign that they reached the middle. According to Yen Xianlu, there is also great fortune at the foot of the 3 peaks, Ling Han said. But as for exactly what it is, the Eternal Prosperity Celestial King did not tell him. Then let us go and take a look. It should not take too much time. The Empress nodded. They headed to the left mountain peak. 7 days later, Hunyo suddenly stopped, and then looked like she was sniffing around. Then her eyes narrowed. So aromatic. Ling Han naturally believed the nose of a glutton with absolute certainty, and asked, What do you smell? The aroma of celestial medicine. Hunyo opened her eyes. So fragrant, at least 5 billion years old, and has reached small accomplishment at least. Then we need to go and take a look. The 4 of them changed course, with Hunyo leading the way. They followed the aroma, and after they walked more than 100 miles, only then did Ling Han and the Empress smell a refreshing fragrance. As expected, they could not compare to a glutton. The 4 of them advanced rapidly, and after just an hour, a pool that was as black as ink appeared ahead of them. An indescribable stench assaulted them, and there was a green bamboo growing in the center of the pool, long and thin. The green bamboo was like a drooping rod, close to 300 meters tall. Practically had no leaves. There were only 6 leaves growing at its highest point, and they bore a crimson fruit. Now that they had arrived here, the fragrance of the celestial medicine had instead vanished. Red-spotted green bamboo, Ling Han immediately exclaimed. By now, he was already familiar with all the celestial medicines in the celestial realm. Even if some celestial medicine had been produced from crossbreeding, he could still discover what its parents were from the slightest clues. Seeing that the three women were still a little puzzled, he explained, "This is indeed a celestial medicine, but the portion that is valuable is not that crimson fruit, but rather those 6 leaves. They each contain different regulations of the great Tao, and if they are consumed together, they would take effect simultaneously. It would be akin to immersing yourself in great Tao. The effects of comprehension would be amazing. However, this celestial bamboo is a treasure in itself. The bamboo pole can be used to forge weapons. Its toughness is at least comparable to 6-star pseudo-divine metal. The older it is, the tougher it is, and if it has reached 100 billion years old, it would be comparable to 9-star pseudo-divine metal, and can become 10-star pseudo-divine metal after 1,000 billion years." Starry-eyed, bewitching Maiden Row could not help but ask, "Then how many years would it need to become divine metal?" Divine metal, who did not want it? Ling Han only quirked his lips and said, "The limit is 10-star pseudo-divine metal. Cannot rush up to the heights of divine metal. This is a natural limit." Bewitching Maiden Row's lips pouted, looking very pitiful. However, in her heart, she was about to go crazy, wanting nothing more than to hang Ling Han up and give him a beating. This damn man was really too unromantic and rude. She was a beauty here, so would he die if he was a little gentler to her? Humph! Isn't it just because you want me to dislike you? I won't. I will cling to you and drive you crazy. And there is that fruit too, Ling Han explained solemnly. Though it cannot be used as medicine, it cannot be called useless. This thing is incredibly and extraordinarily poisonous. The moment the poison makes contact with your hand, it would be useless even if you chopped off your hand. Your whole person would immediately be melted into a pool of blood, which is extremely terrifying. Looking at the color of the bamboo pole, this red-spotted green bamboo should be more or less 6 billion years old. The destructive power of that fruit should be limited to Heaven Soul, or even Immortal Palace tier. The three women all paled. That fruit could kill even Immortal Palace tiers with its poison, and it was through instantly melting into a pool of blood at that. So terrifying. Though they were all extraordinary, especially Hunyo, who had a precious treasure that could save her life, they could not possibly survive the blow of an Immortal Palace tier. Ling Han pointed at that incredibly smelly pool and said, "Look at this pool. It has been formed by the poisonous air that has seeped out of the poisonous fruit." Hearing him say this, the three women hurriedly pinched their noses. No wonder they felt a little dizzy. As it turned out, they had been poisoned. Ling Han shook his head with a laugh and said, "No need to be so nervous. Only actual contact with the poison would cause harm. If it is just the smell alone, it just smells bad. Even so, looking at the expressions of the three women, they would still withdraw even if it meant giving up this celestial medicine." Women sigh women. Ling Han took a few steps forwards and began to circle around the pool, studying how he was supposed to retrieve this celestial bamboo. He first moved directly, his origin power forming a hand to directly extract the celestial bamboo, but it was as if this celestial bamboo had been joined with the ground here. If he wanted to pull out the celestial bamboo, he would have to pull out the ground here. If this was another place, this actually wouldn't be much of a problem either. With Ling Han's present power, to say nothing of the ground here, even if it was a few dozen stars added together, he would still be able to carry them easily. The problem was that this was a natural mystery realm, and there was a great amount of celestial king blood spilled here. There was some nameless change taking place here, so heaving up the ground here became an impossible feat. He pushed the hand of origin power forwards a bit, but sizzling sounds immediately rang out. The giant hand of origin power was presently being rapidly corroded, and he could clearly see that a giant hand had become a half, and then disappeared completely. Ling Han gave a muffled grunt, and when he raised his hand, he saw that a black seal had actually appeared on the palm of his hand, and it was still spreading. This was the poison of the red-spotted green bamboo. Ling Han hurriedly channeled the indestructible heavens scroll. Wang golden light appeared on his hand, and an incredibly noble seal appeared, then suppressed, and soon destroyed that black-colored seal. Such terrifying poison. He had not made direct contact at all, and it had still been transmitted over from the giant hand of origin power, and it could still cause such frightening damage even then. Then, if it was direct contact with the poison water, that really would mean instantly melting into blood. He would not even have the chance to channel the indestructible Heaven Scroll. Being capable of killing an immortal palace tier elite with its poison was indeed no joke. Ling Han frowned. This poison should only be transmitted through direct contact, but why had it taken effect when it was just contact with the air here? He took a closer look and gave an "oh." As it turned out, the temperature of the pool was slightly high, so steam was rising from it. And it was this steam that had touched the giant hand of origin power, transmitting the poison. At the beginning, the giant hand of origin power was at a high enough point, so it had not been touched by the steam, but when it descended slightly, this caused the poison to explode. Ling Han shook his head. This really was a little troubling. How was he supposed to retrieve the celestial bamboo then? He turned to look at the three women. If there were more of them, they should be able to come up with more ideas. The three women all shook their heads. They did not want to risk getting in contact with the poison in the slightest. It should be known that every part of their skin was supple and soft. If it was even the slightest bit damaged, and they were no longer beautiful, what were they supposed to do? Even Hunyou was no exception on this point, no longer as carefree as she had been. Ling Han could only think of an idea on his own. Use the divine demon sword? This was a future celestial tool, and while it was a little weak at the moment, it should be able to resist the poison. Ling Han tried it out, and true enough, the divine demon sword had no fear of the poison, and would not be corroded. However, this weapon was only at the level of 3-star pseudo-celestial tool at present, so what could it do to the toughness of the celestial bamboo? If a 3-star pseudo-celestial tool would be cut by a 6-star pseudo-celestial tool, what justice was there left in this world? Ling Han used another method, wanting to empty out the waters in the pool. Then, he would be able to dig out the roots of this celestial bamboo and easily retrieve it. But the problem was, what vessel could bear the corrosion of the poisonous waters? The moment lower-level pseudo-divine metal was placed in, it would be turned into dust, and the divine demon sword could not be used like a pail either. Ling Han was stuck in a dilemma. This treasure was just in front of his eyes, yet he could only look at it from afar and lament. His thoughts ran furiously, and he came up with another idea. Burn. Ling Han had the three women retreat far away, and then channeled the 9 heavens flame towards the pool. Under such intense and blazing heat, he was sure that this pool of water would soon be burnt completely. That would lead to the same result. Out of Ling Han's expectations, this pool of water was very hard to evaporate. Half a day had passed and just a little had been burned up. As long as there was an effect, that was fine. Ling Han firmed his will and decided to just spend his time here. He pushed the 9 heavens flame to its limits. In any case, because of the limitation of his own cultivation level, it was impossible for the 9 heavens flame to release the full might of celestial king tier, so there was no need for him to worry about damaging the celestial bamboo. Additionally, because the 9 heavens flame was a source power of heaven and earth, there naturally would be no need for him to worry about being countered by the poison. Day after day passed, and the water level of the pool was also decreasing bit by bit. He was close to success. The pool's bottom was finally about to appear. Ling Han exerted some more effort, and the 9 heavens flame blazed fiercely, evaporating the last bit of steam. And now the pool was empty. It was guaranteed that there would not be the slightest bit of liquid left. Ling Han used the divine demon sword like a spade, and began digging in the pool. This took him a further 7 days, and only then did he manage to cleanly uproot the complex system of roots of the celestial bamboo, which he then stowed into the Black Tower. What was unfortunate was that even the Black Tower could not nurture this celestial bamboo, unless it had gained its own intelligence, and could cultivate on its own like the 7 lives divine clouds. Ling Han dealt with the celestial bamboo. Though the fruit was extremely poisonous, it was also very useful, and could be used as a great fatal weapon. He plucked out the leaves of bamboo, which he then placed beneath the Reincarnation tree. This could preserve its freshness, locking in the dispersion of the regulations of heaven and earth, and could also further improve its medicinal effects by enshrouding it in the aura of the reincarnation tree. He could not do anything to the bamboo stalk for now, and Ling Han could not extract too much strength even inside the Black Tower. 6-star pseudo-divine metal. He really couldn't process it further. Whatever, he would hand it over to a skilled craftsman to be made into something useful once he went out. Ling Han exited the Black Tower, a smile on his face. After working hard for over a month, he had finally reaped a good harvest. It was not the time to divide the loot now. Hence, the four of them immediately continued on their way. After over a month of delay, who knew if it would affect their chances of contesting for the great fortune on the 3 mountain peaks? As they traveled, they naturally encountered a great many monsters again. There were a good few that were Earth Soul level among them. Ling Han did not draw on the power of the Black Tower, but rather used the poisonous fruit of the red-spotted green bamboo to deal with one of them just to test out its effects. He had only used a bit, which he smeared on the tip of the blade of the divine demon sword. But when he delivered a stab, that monster immediately decayed. Of course, Ling Han's body had also been pierced harshly by the spikes of the monster, his entire body bleeding all over, almost damaging his godly bones. It was, after all, a powerful Earth Soul level attack. Even if it had been someone the likes of Yan Xianlu, he would probably have collapsed under such bleeding. But Ling Han had only bled a little. The strength of his physique could really be considered freakish. The poison on the blade only weakened after 7 uses, and by the 11th monster, it practically did not have any effect left. Though Ling Han was pierced all over, he was very satisfied. He was gaining more and more of this Celestial King Bloodstone, which should be enough to allow the Empress and Hunyo to gain a preliminary grasp of the regulation of slaughter. This regulation was really extraordinarily powerful, and anyone who used it would know. Fairy Row. What about me? Me? Because there was no need for them to change course at all. Ling Han and his group speed naturally increased. Another 2 months later, they finally arrived at the foot of the left peak. From a distance, it seemed like a peak, but upon closer look, this was rather an incredibly colossal mountain, with an unknown perimeter. Anyways, it was just overwhelmingly huge. Wang, there would be occasional veined patterns glowing on the surface of the mountain, as if it had a life of its own, and was presently breathing. Ling Han raised his head, and could see that there were presently a few people that were just beginning to climb. At first, their speed was very fast, but when the veins glowed, they immediately stopped and held tightly onto the surface of the mountain. They only continued to climb further when the veins had completely dimmed. Ah! Someone suddenly slipped and dropped down from the skies. There was a regulation of gravity here. It had far surpassed the level that severing mundane tier could grasp. Thus, no one would be able to fly in this place. Pong, he directly dropped onto the ground, creating a deep pit in the ground. After a while, that person finally clambered out of the pit. He was completely covered in blood, a few bones directly piercing out of his body. They were broken and the bone marrow was visible. How pitiful. That person hurriedly consumed an alchemical pill, then sat down, and channeled his cultivation technique to guide the medicinal effects so that he could recover his battle prowess as soon as possible. It was extremely dangerous to sustain a serious injury in this kind of natural mystery realm. Even if your opponent did not deal you a fatal blow, there would still be other dangers, such as the monsters that rampaged around in this place. Let's go to. The 4 of them began climbing. Now that they had left the ground, they immediately felt how terrifying the gravity was in this place. Even for monarch tiers and emperor tiers like themselves, it was still extremely straining. Ling Han, Nyo wants you to carry me. Nyo clung onto Ling Han's back. So heavy. Ling Han gritted his teeth. With another person's weight, it was not something as simple as doubling the difficulty. The Empress gave them a glance, and did not say anything, but instead directly ran, and grabbed one of Ling Han's arms. There was nothing that could be done. The best position was already occupied by Hunyo. An idea flashed in bewitching Maiden Ro's mind, and she, too, approached shamelessly, clinging onto Ling Han's other arm. Fuck! Do you guys have no arms and legs? Ling Han hissed. The combined weight of 3 people all added onto him alone caused the pressure he had to sustain to increase by at least 100 times, and he immediately felt like his arms and legs were about to be ripped off. And this was because his physique was incredibly tough at that. Otherwise, his arms and legs would have been severed by now. However, this could be considered as a good type of training exercise. Ling Han no longer gritted or bared his teeth. Instead, his expression was solemn as he began to climb. The moment he moved, the gravity increased considerably. Immediately, sweat was pouring down his forehead, and his whole body was soon completely dampened by sweat as well. Wang, the mountain suddenly glowed, and a vein was streaking down from the summit like a lightning bolt. Though this was Ling Han's first experience, with a predecessor in front of him, he hurriedly remained stationary and unmoving, clinging tightly to the mountain with his body. Pung, pung, pung. As the vein surged past, a strong feeling of repulsion also emerged from the mountain, wanting to send everything unfamiliar flying. Thankfully, Ling Han was sticking closely and strongly enough. Otherwise, he would definitely have been sent flying with the 3 women that were on him. No wonder those people would remain unmoving at this time, yet some had still been sent flying down. It was indeed very powerful. Ling Han pulled himself together and continued his upwards climb. His willpower was incredibly strong. Previously, he had even taken the black murderous curse on to temper himself. This kind of willpower was definitely freakish. Even if he was carrying 3 women, his speed was actually getting faster and faster. He was scaling the mountain like an agile monkey. After an hour, those who had been ahead of him were already within sight. He surpassed them like he was a gust of smoke. That was a man and a woman, and from the looks of it, they seemed to be a couple because they were climbing very closely together. When Ling Han passed them by, the man deliberately leaned towards the woman, obviously protecting her. When they saw how Ling Han was not only advancing like he was walking on flat ground, and was even bringing 3 women with him at the same time, this couple both looked stunned, practically incapable of believing that this was possible. After a while, the woman sweetly said, "Brother Ma, I, too, want you to carry me on your back." "Fine, get on." The man gritted his teeth and agreed. The woman leaped onto the man and hung onto him. The man immediately hissed sharply, his forehead all creased. This was really too fucking heavy. Gritting his teeth, he began to climb. But just like with a mortal that was carrying 1,000-pound weight, it was incredibly hard just staying still, and moving was practically capable of killing him. Just at this moment, a vein began to vibrate. The man hurriedly stood firmly on a mountain rock, but with the approach of the strong tremor, there was no way he could possibly hold onto the mountain rock. He had directly been sent flying. Ah! Ah! This couple screamed out simultaneously, a string of curse words streaking through their mind. It was all Ling Han's fault. If he had not been showing off in front of them, how could they have wanted to follow in his footsteps? This highly difficult technique of showing affection in public was indeed not something that everyone could learn. Fuck. The 2 of them soon turned into 2 tiny black dots, no longer seen again. Another month later, Ling Han finally stopped. It was not because they had reached the summit, but rather that the slope had become level and flat here. He did not need to advance by gripping the steep angles of the mountain rocks any longer. The 3 women also reluctantly released their hold. Clinging on to Ling Han was something that they could get addicted to. It was easy for them to lose themselves in his masculine smell, especially in the case of bewitching Maiden Ro. This was her first time being in such intimate contact with Ling Han. Her face had directly flushed red, and her alluring eyes were as soft as water, indescribably cloying and sweet. Ling Han sighed in relief and said, "You guys are really quite heavy. In the future, you guys would really have to lose weight." While he had advanced very fast, it did not mean that the weight he had to sustain had become any less. It was only that his willpower was strong, and he had forcibly suppressed his weariness. What woman liked to hear someone say that she was heavy, especially when the speaker was their lover? Hence, Ling Han was ganged up on by the 3 women, and after a bout of soft punches and kicks, the 4 of them finally continued on their way. There was no mountain path here. The craggy mountain rose and fell in succession. Every mountain rock was strangely shaped and bizarre. Amidst a ringing cry, a celestial crane appeared, its wings flapping in the air. There was actually a person borne on its back. His brows and beard were completely white, and he looked quite sage-like. The speed of the celestial crane was very fast, and in a few flaps it had already disappeared at the summit. Ling Han and the others exchanged looks, and could see shock in each other's eyes. What was going on here? A celestial crane had actually appeared in this natural mystery realm? Ha! The four of them exclaimed in shock at the same time because the craggy mountain rock around them had actually disappeared, and a wide, long path of white jade had appeared in front of them, winding all the way to the mountain summit. Even while standing here, it was as if they could see a majestic palace at the summit. Its walls were bronze, and exuded an indescribably imposing air, seemingly capable of suppressing the heaven and earth and time. In fact, they could even see that there were a great many people on the mountain path, worshipping on the whole way, as if they were the most faithful of believers. They would kowtow 3 times with every step, and were advancing to the summit at an extremely slow pace. With every bow, the bronze palace seemed to brighten a slightest bit more. Though this kind of chance was very negligible, Ling Han and his group, being either monarch tiers or emperor tiers, could still feel this kind of change. This is power of belief, Hunyo said. Belief is also a type of energy, and is a power that is unique to the world, and would not be controlled by great Tao. Even though a single believer's strength is weak, gathering the power of belief of thousands, of millions of believers would also affect a qualitative change. Ling Han nodded. Something like power of the nation? Not really, because power of the nation would require establishing a nation first, and using the totem as a medium to gather the power of the citizens. Hunyo shook her head. As the heir of a 9th heaven celestial king tier-level force, who also had the brand that had been left behind by a 9th heaven celestial king, her knowledge base was very broad and wide. The height of belief far surpasses power of the nation, and power of the nation would mean a feeling of belonging to this nation, while belief is about the individual, which is completely different. However, the power of belief, too, has its weaknesses. Why would believers want to believe in you? Hunyo paused. That is because believers would encounter dilemmas, and at that time, they would ask the target of their belief for help. If they do not get any response, the believers may lose faith. It may be very, very hard for a believer to encounter a dilemma in 100 years, but once the numbers are increased, that would be great trouble. Ling Han nodded and said, going by the looks of things, this was definitely the place of enlightenment for a celestial king before, but a great battle happened one day, and everything was destroyed, turning into the model of the Three Blooms Valley. Afterwards, the power of heaven and earth began to transform this place, and thus the present Three Blooms Valley came to be, the Empress continued. Hence, everything is only an illusion. It is the image of prosperity that was left behind from countless years ago, when the place of enlightenment of the celestial king still existed. Bewitching Maiden Ro also said. As she spoke, the majestic mountain path and those faithful believers also disappeared all of a sudden. After all, this was only a fragment of the long passage of history, and had long since died, only available for later generations to reminisce. Ling Han and his group sighed slightly. At the time, that celestial king was at least 7th heaven, and he should have been immortal for eternity, but now he had completely vanished in the long passage of history, and even his name was known to no one. Even celestial kings were like this, then what true immortality was there? How could one truly cast away the bonds of life and death, and exist for eternity? Hunyo began to wrinkle her tiny nose again. So fragrant. Another celestial medicine? Ling Han asked. He naturally was incredibly confident in the little girl's sense of smell. Hunyo leaned her head to one side, and after some thought she said, it should be celestial medicine, but it is a little strange. What's strange about it? Ling Han asked. I don't know how to say it. Anyways, it is just very strange. Ling Han thought for a moment, and then said, whatever the case, let's search for it first. It was still Hunyo leading the way. Not too long after, both Ling Han and the Empress also smelled the fragrance that was unique to celestial medicine. A single sniff was enough for them to know. Their spirit instantly resonated with the great Tao, and was not something that could be replaced by any other substance. They went off in search of the fragrance, and very soon, they found a mountain cave that was incredibly dark. The fragrance of the celestial medicine originated from within the mountain cave. Smell of blood. Hunyo wrinkled her little nose again, showing a ferocious expression. She was especially sensitive when it came to things like killing intent. Was it because those that had previously reached this place had conflicted over the celestial medicine, which had led to a major battle? Everyone, be careful. Ling Han strode forwards, heading to the cave entrance. Now that they were already here, there was naturally no logic in giving up halfway. He naturally would have to take a look. The Empress and the others also followed, but they circled around once inside, yet discovered nothing. The herbal fragrance was there, but there was no sign of the celestial medicine. Perhaps it has already been taken. Let's go. The four of them shook their heads, exited the mountain cave, and continued their way towards the summit. When Ling Han and his group had completely vanished, a person walked out of the mountain cave. It was Ji Wuming. His eyes flickered, and he murmured, "All four of them are divine fetuses. If I can swallow them, my divine fetus would definitely be able to improve further. Too bad, those three are not easily trifled with, especially that little girl. She should be the reincarnation of an old friend. Forget it, let's catch enough fish here first, and then think of a way to swallow the divine fetuses of those four people." Someone else is coming. A menacing expression appeared on his face as he slowly retreated into the mountain cave. The refreshing fragrance of celestial medicine drifted out vaguely. A male figure streaked past, and then suddenly stopped. His eyes were fixed on the mountain cave, showing an overjoyed expression. This was a monarch tier of the wide prosperity heaven, ranked 13th, and he had astonishing strength. Inside the cave, vision would be affected, and the space was also limited. If someone lay in ambush to launch a sneak attack, that would be an extremely terrible thing that could happen. But he smiled proudly and strode forwards boldly. As a powerful monarch tier, what was there for him to fear? Pong! He had not entered for too long when the sounds of intense battle were heard from within the cave. The mountain rock here was frighteningly tough, and even a battle between severing mundane tiers couldn't cause any damage. There were only terrifying storms of energy continuously barraging out of the cave's entrance. However, it had only taken a while, and the cave returned to a state of peace. Ji Wuming walked out, a sliver of blood at the corners of his lips. However, with a lick of his tongue, it was wiped off cleanly. He showed a smile of satisfaction. "I am only missing 9 top-tier divine fetuses, and my heaven-seizing fortune technique will reach great accomplishment." If Ling Han and the others were here, they would definitely discover that Ji Wuming's present aura was slightly different from previously. His whole person exuded an evil vibe, but it was one that would not cause discomfort. And he slanted his head slightly to the side. "Someone else is here, but does not seem an easy target. Xiao." His words had not even been finished when he saw a man with short build appear out of nowhere. His whole face was covered with wrinkles, as if he was about to kick the bucket at any time. "Tang Minglong. We should have met, right?" Tang Minglong stared at Ji Wuming. Ji Wuming broke into a smile. "Hadn't we just given our names a few months ago at the valley entrance?" Tang Minglong shook his head. "Before that." Ji Wuming shook his head as well. "This is my first visit to the wide prosperity heaven, so it should be impossible." Tang Minglong stared into Ji Wuming's eyes and calmly stated, "What I am speaking of is not your present lifetime." The smile on Ji Wuming's face immediately disappeared, and he stared back at Tang Minglong. The two of them just stared at each other, neither speaking. "I am getting an extremely bad feeling from you." Tang Minglong's face was expressionless. "I do not care if you wreak havoc in other places, but in the wide prosperity heaven, I forbid you from taking one step in. Otherwise, I will kill you." At first, Ji Wuming did not respond, but after a while, a smile appeared at the corners of his lips, and then he broke into laughter. I know now you should be that Xiao character, right? I really had not imagined that you, too, would have the chance to transmigrate and reincarnate. Isn't it the same for you? Tang Minglong asked calmly. Seeing that Tang Minglong did not deny it, the smile on Ji Wuming's face slowly faded, turning into a mocking grin. Xiao Tianxiong, 8th Heaven Celestial King, with extraordinary battle prowess. Too bad you have long since died. You are but a lingering spirit that is dragging out your existence, and have gained the chance for a new life. So what could you do to me? I am more than capable of killing you, Tang Minglong declared menacingly, his tone instantly becoming incredibly frosty. If their conversation was heard by other severing mundane tears, they would definitely pale in shock. Tang Minglong really was the reincarnation of a celestial king, and an 8th heaven existence at that. That was just a step away from the ultimate pinnacle, and in the whole celestial realm, that could be considered a being of the highest tier. But this kind of celestial king had still died, leaving behind only a sliver of his spirit, gone through some kind of reincarnation cycle and had come back to life. The cultivation of his last lifetime had been severed, and he could only start right from the beginning again. Ji Wuming did not have the slightest bit of fear, and slowly asked, Xiao Tianxiong, do you know why I wish to reincarnate? Seeing the unconcerned expression on Tang Minglong's face, he continued, I did not die in my last life, but have rather given up my body of a celestial king on my own initiative, and barged forcefully into the reincarnation cycle. What? At this, Tang Minglong finally revealed an expression of shock. In fact, a layer of goosebumps broke out on his skin, as if he was a mortal that had encountered a ghost. You, he stuttered, incoherent in his words. Ji Wuming bared his teeth in a grin. Now, it is very hard for me to kill you, but you wanting to kill me is even more impossible. Thus, it is best that we each mind our own business. Otherwise, even if I had to use my trump card a few times, killing you would be a piece of cake. Strangely, Tang Minglong did not refute his words. Hi's whole body was trembling. Even an ordinary 9th Heaven Celestial King cannot possibly barge forcibly into the reincarnation cycle. Who exactly are you? How many battle merits have you achieved that you would be doted on thus by the heaven and earth? Ji Wuming fell silent, and showed a sliver of rare solemnness in his expression. After a long while only did he say, I have battled for too long on borders, and I have already forgotten who I am. Since you, too, returned from there, you should know just how grim the situation is over there. Yes, Tang Minglong nodded solemnly, bearing a sliver of respect, or even reverence. This was extremely shocking. In his last life, he had been an 8th Heaven Celestial King, practically an elite of the highest tier, yet he would actually show an expression of reverence to another. Then, just what kind of existence was Ji Wuming? 9th Heaven Celestial King. What was going on? A 9th Heaven Celestial King would also die? No, going by Ji Wuming's words, it was he himself who had given up his Celestial King body, and barged into that whatever reincarnation place, and only then did this completely new and severing mundane tier Ji Wuming come to be. For what reason? Why had he brought hardship on himself? Wasn't a 9th Heaven Celestial King already an existence of the highest tier, and he still had to give up his own physical body? Those old guys just want to protect themselves without any thought of others. To completely eliminate the storm of darkness, only a heavenly venerable tier can do so. Ji Wuming spoke, his voice slow, but capable of cutting across the ages like the sounding of a temple bell. Tang Minglong appeared to be even more respectful and said, For the sake of eliminating the storm of darkness, you, Lord, did not hesitate to even give up your 9th Heaven Celestial King body. This junior is impressed. However, he showed a sliver of hesitation. These young people are presently all hopes for the future, so please have mercy, my lord. For the greater cause, there must be sacrifices, Ji Wuming stated calmly. I can even give up my 9th Heaven Celestial King body, and risk death just to barge into the reincarnation cycle. I can even make such a sacrifice, so could these young juniors not sacrifice a bit too? Tang Minglong clearly did not agree with his opinion. But there are no buts, Ji Wuming interrupted decisively. Seeing how you, too, have made much contribution at the border, I have spoken so much with you, but if you speak further, I will take your life. Tang Minglong hesitated, but he very quickly said, the only reason I reincarnated was because I wished to return to Celestial King Tier, and then return to the border to stand against the storm of darkness. My purpose is to safeguard and protect our descendants. But you, my lord, want me to just sit by and watch as you kill the hope for our future. Then, please forgive this junior for being incapable of obeying you. Just like E of the wide prosperity heaven, he is extraordinarily prodigious, and there is a high possibility for him to become a ninth heaven celestial king in the future. He could become the main force in resisting the storm of darkness in the future. Such a prodigy should not die at your hand, my lord, but rather should be given the chance to grow and mature. What short-sighted vision! Ji Wuming declared balefully. All of a sudden he charged towards Tang Minglong, extending a palm. Boom! The whole world turned into complete darkness, and only this hand that seemed like an eternal existence that seemed capable of striking open the heaven and earth seemed to be left, suppressing all existence. This possessed the might of a celestial king, but it was not the complete might of a celestial king either, so it was like how Ling Han possessed the nine heavens flame. That was clearly celestial king tier level existence, but because it was limited by his cultivation level, it belonged to the celestial king tier in essence, yet its might was considerably inferior to that. Forgive my offense, my lord, Tang Minglong exclaimed softly. Pa pa pa. The bones in his entire body crackled loudly, and he instantly turned from a dwarf of short stature to a 7 feet tall man of broad build, exploding in a burst of supreme might. He greeted the incoming attack without fear, righteous and justified. Speaking in terms of their past lives, Tang Minglong was definitely no match for Ji Wuming. An 8th heaven celestial king standing against a 9th heaven celestial king in a head-on confrontation would only result in the former's death. But at present they were both 5th severance monarch tiers, and limited by their cultivation level, the amount of 8th heaven and 9th heaven celestial king power that they could draw on was actually not much different. Thus, the battle was very intense, and it was hard to determine who would be coming out on top. It was indeed just like how Ji Wuming had said at the beginning. It would not be easy for him to kill Tang Minglong, as he would have to use some kind of ultimate move, but Tang Minglong killing him was a completely impossible feat. The fierce battle was continuing without stopping. After ascending to this height, there were surprisingly fewer obstacles. Ling Han and the others only took a few hours to reach an area near the mountain peak. Mists and clouds swirled, and this place seemed much like a celestial abode. A group of people appeared before them. Xu Yering, Yen Xianlu, and the others were all among this group. Ling Han walked over and asked, Brother Yen, why have you all stopped here? Yen Xianlu shook his head with a sigh and said, Brother Ling, I truly can't bear to tell you. I'm afraid that you'll beat your chest and stomp your feet in frustration. Ling Han involuntarily chuckled and said, Then I'm even more curious to find out. Yen Xianlu nodded before pointing ahead and saying, There's a stone tablet before us. Fuck! Shitface! Do you want to die? Hunyo immediately shouted. This person actually dared to mess with them. Yen Xianlu faltered upon hearing this. Before Hunyo, he truly didn't dare to play any tricks on Ling Han and the others. He hurriedly said, This is no simple stone tablet. Rather, it's been formed and nurtured by heaven and earth. Inscribed on it is the true meaning of the Great Tao. True meaning of the Great Tao? Yes, true meaning of the Great Tao. Ling Han and the Empress both wore expressions of confusion. Meanwhile, Hunyo immediately jumped forward, rolling up her sleeves and saying, Where is it? Where is it? It's Nyo's. She was wearing an expression of greed. What exactly is it? Ling Han asked Yen Xianlu. Brother Ling, what we cultivate and comprehend is the regulations of heaven and earth. However, regulations are formless and intangible, so each person possesses their own unique understanding of the Great Tao. No one can say for sure whether their comprehension is correct, Yen Xianlu said with a serious expression. Ling Han nodded in agreement. This was indeed the case. even though he possessed two source powers in the Nine Heavens Flame and the Xianxia source water. He still needed to use a lot of trial and error when trying to comprehend the great Tao of heaven and earth. At most, possessing two source powers only allowed this process to become much easier for him compared to other people. However, the true meaning of the great Tao, Yan Xianlu paused for a moment before continuing. This is something that heaven and earth have formed through some mysterious method. Through this, you can truly comprehend the great Tao in a leisurely manner. Of course, the true meaning of the great Tao is only the most fundamental matter. However, the most important thing in cultivation is none other than such fundamentals. Ling Han agreed with this assertion. While in Guanhua City, he had given an in-depth explanation about such fundamental matters. However, even three-star alchemists had been inspired by his explanations, and in the end, they had all viewed him with utmost respect. In fact, they had almost treated Ling Han like their teacher. Regardless of how talented one was, regulations would still be formless. As such, it was almost impossible to obtain a perfect grasp of them. Even ninth heaven celestial kings would have some very slight imperfections in their grasp of regulations. However, with the true meaning of the great Tao, everything would be different. By observing this true meaning, one could fix up their imperfections one by one. By doing so, they could eventually obtain a flawless grasp of the regulations. However, there are far too many regulations in the world, so it's hard to say which one this stone tablet is targeting, Yan Xianlu said. Is there some kind of insurmountable abyss ahead? Why has everyone stopped here? Ling Han asked with a smile. With such a treasure lying ahead, it was only normal that everyone charged forward with courage and excitement. Yet, they were all standing here for some reason. It's not an insurmountable abyss. Rather, it's a sinister dog, Yan Xianlu replied. Dog? I love to pummel dogs, Hunyo shouted as she roughly pushed her way through the crowd of people. Even though many people stumbled and fell as they were pushed aside by her, none of them dared to say anything. After all, Hunyo had already become renowned for her hot temper. Thus, they could only shoot a frustrated glare at her. Wow! What a large toad! What an ugly toad! Hunyo exclaimed. She then ran back in displeasure, pointing at Yan Xianlu and saying, Where's the dog? Where's the dog that you promised? Yan Xianlu was rendered speechless. After a brief moment, he said, I only mentioned dog as a metaphor. As the saying goes, good dogs don't block the path. Nyo doesn't care. Hurry up and give me a dog to pummel, Hunyo shouted. Ling Han also walked over, only to see a flat platform ahead. There was a large stone tablet resting on this platform, and it looked like it was cut from jade. There were various symbols inscribed into the stone tablet, yet it was as if they were being obscured by a layer of mist. Even with his astonishing eyesight, he could only just make out the first few symbols. However, this was already enough to send billowing waves through his mind. A burst of murderous aura rose, and projections of swords and sabers continued to flash across his eyes. Regulation of slaughter. This was the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter. The others were unaware of this, because they hadn't cultivated the regulation of slaughter before. However, Ling Han had already cultivated this regulation for quite some time, so he immediately felt some resonance upon glancing at the symbols on the stone tablet. No wonder Yan Xianlu described the true meaning of the great Tao as a precious treasure. Indeed, Ling Han was already experiencing billowing waves in his mind after glancing at just the first few symbols. He obtained countless understandings, and these allowed him to determine many of the mistakes that he had made while cultivating the regulation of slaughter. However, it was a shame that a giant toad was sprawled across the stone tablet, covering a portion of the symbols. In any case, even the uncovered portion was unclear, and it was as if heaven and earth had reached over to cover it from view. I have to get closer to the stone tablet. Anyhow, this toad was no different from the previous monsters. Its body was filled with sharp spikes, and this caused it to look even uglier and stranger than it already was. Ling Han turned around and asked, Is this toad extremely strong? It's at the heaven soul, so what do you think? A monarch tear from the wide prosperity heaven said. There was a hint of disdain in his voice, and it was as if he were feeling a sense of superiority. Ling Han involuntarily chuckled and said, "What are you feeling so smug about? Perhaps I can't defeat Heaven Soul elites, but can you? I truly don't understand where your sense of superiority is coming from." The monarch Tyr immediately flushed red with anger and embarrassment. However, he was rendered completely speechless, so he could only glare at Ling Han in anger. Indeed, he couldn't defeat this monster either. However, after seeing those more powerful than him also suffering defeat, he couldn't help but feel a mysterious sense of joy. He felt as if they were no better than him. "Brother Ling, a monster at the Heaven Soul has already exceeded the limits of our abilities. If we fight against it one-on-one, that will be nothing more than seeking death. Why don't we put aside the differences between the two heavens first? Why don't we team up to shoo the monster away?" Shu Yering walked over and said to Ling Han. Nyo glared at Shu Yering and said, "Ugly woman, what are you trying to do to Nyo's Ling Han?" She was like a cautious tiger protecting her food. Shu Yering smiled and said, "You're more beautiful than me, and your cultivation talent is also superior to mine. That being the case, is there any need to be so afraid of me? Perhaps you lack confidence in yourself." Nyo humped and said, "Of course Nyo is confident. However, one after another, all of you ugly women are overestimating yourselves. Yet, you still insist on sticking your face over." Nyo is super annoyed. Nyo's words captured a very large group of women. Bewitching Maiden Ro couldn't help but cough upon hearing this. Her expression was slightly awkward. Shu Yering's smile was still extremely composed and elegant, and she said, "Rest assured, I'm only inviting you to team up with us to deal with that toad." "Fine, since you're so understanding, Nyo won't argue with you anymore," Nyo said as she grabbed Ling Han's right arm. It was as if she were declaring her ownership. She was a jealous little lover. Ling Han gazed into the distance and said, "Heaven Soul elites are heaven knows how much more powerful than Earth Soul elites. Even if we team up, our chances of defeating the monster are still slim. But we still have to try. Otherwise, how can we be sure?" Shu Yering said, "When it comes to such fundamental understandings, the earlier we master them, the better. Otherwise, once we've assembled our tower of cultivation, any deficiency in the foundations might cause a catastrophic collapse. So, if we don't fight for it now, when else will we?" Her words were very persuasive. Even though her target was Ling Han, many in the surroundings involuntarily nodded upon hearing this. Even Yen Xianlu was no exception. Ling Han smiled and said, "Fine, then let's give it a shot. For the sake of the true meaning of the Great Tao, the wide prosperity heaven and the calm peace heaven temporarily put aside their differences. They decided to team up. Before coming here, everyone had already made the necessary preparations. For example, Yen Xianlu, Lujia, and the others had already prepared some sort of formation that could greatly increase their battle prowess. This was in order to rival Shu Yering and the other freakish prodigies. Now, however, this monster at the Heaven Soul was definitely far more powerful than Shu Yering and the other supreme prodigies. Thus, they had to team up to battle against it. In fact, Ling Han still possessed a trump card. That was the poisonous fruit of the red-spotted green bamboo. What did it matter that this was a monster at the Heaven Soul? A single drop of juice from the poisonous fruit would immediately render it dead. However, Ling Han didn't want to use it now. After all, it was one of his biggest trump cards. As such, it didn't make sense to use it now. Everyone gathered together, yet they were still somewhat separated into smaller groups, each of which was in its own formation. Thus, everyone still seemed disorganized and dispersed. Shu Yering frowned and said, "What's going on with Tang Minglong? He still hasn't come yet." He was someone who was as powerful as her. If Tang Minglong were here, their chance of success would be much greater. However, they couldn't wait forever. Anyhow, with the addition of Ling Han and Nyo, they could somewhat make up for the loss of Tang Minglong. At least, this was what Shu Yering thought. "Listen to my command," Shu Yering said. She was going to command this battle, and this caused the Empress and Nyo to feel extremely displeased. Why did they have to listen to her? However, Ling Han didn't care much about this. This was only temporary cooperation, so it wouldn't matter who acted as the leader. Go! Xu Yaring took the lead and charged forward, slashing with her sword as she did so. A dazzling burst of light surged forward, carrying with it boundless and undulating regulations. It was as if heaven and earth were going to be forcefully sliced apart as the brilliant sword ray left a trail of darkness in its wake. The others also moved, and almost 100 prodigies unleashed their attacks in unison. Croak! The toad had initially been sprawled over the stone tablet and lazily sleeping. When the prodigies entered some boundary, however, it suddenly opened its sanguine red eyes, which were filled with a boundless aura of murder. It shook its body. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sky was instantly filled with spikes, which rained down on the prodigies. Each spike possessed a terrifying murderous aura, and it was as if they were paramount celestial tools that could obliterate all matter. Ling Han didn't know whether these spikes could truly obliterate all matter. However, they could definitely kill those at the fifth severance with ease. He had severely underestimated this toad. Ling Han hurriedly dashed to the side to protect the Empress, Hunyo, and bewitching Maiden Ro. At the same time, he also channeled the indestructible Heaven Scroll, raising his defenses to the max. Pu, Piu, Piu, Piu. At least 7 spikes smashed into him in unison, unleashing their regulation of slaughter as they did so. Waves of black light swarmed, and they yearned to burn through Ling Han's defenses so that they could forcefully impale him. However, by channeling the indestructible Heaven Scroll, Ling Han could definitely defend against attacks from those at the Heaven Soul. The spikes were unable to penetrate Ling Han's defenses, yet the colossal momentum that they possessed easily lifted him up and sent him flying. Boom! Ling Han and the others crashed into a mountain wall behind them. Rumble! Broken rocks and dust rained down. Meanwhile, Ling Han and the others finally came to a stop. However, apart from Ling Han, the 3 women all spat a mouthful of blood. Even though they hadn't been directly hit by the attack, the collision just then had still wounded them significantly. In fact, only Ling Han was unscathed thanks to the protection of the indestructible Heaven Scroll. As expected of a monster at the Heaven Soul, its attack is far too terrifying. However, this was only Ling Han's view. As for the others, just then, Ling Han had neither the time nor effort to concentrate on them. Glancing over now, what he saw was a large group of wounded cultivators. Some had been pierced in the abdomen, while others had been stabbed through the arms or legs. As for those whose divine senses had been breached, it was almost certain that they were dead. Even if they weren't, their expressions were as grim as could be. They were all ingesting treasured medicines or using other kinds of life-saving treasures to suppress the murderous aura of the spikes. Being at the Heaven Soul, this murderous aura would have a crushing power after entering their bodies. It could almost instantly breach their minds and obliterate their divine senses. Thus, for the sake of their lives, what couldn't these prodigies sacrifice? This was a miserable scene. There were hundreds of Emperor Tears and Monarch Tears, yet they couldn't even make it near the toad, and 7 of them had already been killed. In addition, dozens had been severely wounded, and only fewer than 10 had escaped with minor wounds. Xu Yaring had naturally only sustained minor wounds. Even though she had led the charge, her title as the 2nd strongest severing mundane tier elite of the wide prosperity heaven was no exaggeration. Her battle prowess was extremely astounding. At the very least, her defenses were definitely freakish. However, she certainly wasn't feeling smug at this moment. She was well aware of her own abilities, so there was naturally no need to feel smug. The problem was, how were they going to deal with this toad? It was far too powerful. In fact, she could dispose of this toad all by herself. However, she would need to pay a significant price. Moreover, it would also render her defenseless for a short while. Thus, she naturally couldn't choose this option, especially since there were so many people around. This was unless she could guarantee her safety. However, whom here could she trust? Anyhow, what could they do now? The precious treasure was right before them, so there was no reason to abandon it just like that. In the outside world, those at the Heaven Soul wouldn't have the right to refer to themselves as elites. Only those at or above the Immortal Palace tier had this right. Here, however, A monster at the heaven soul was much like an invincible being. Even monarch tears were helpless against it. How about, we look for the fiery flame lightning strike wood first? Someone suggested. All right, then you go, someone immediately said in retort. No one was willing to leave at this moment. After all, they had no idea where the fiery flame lightning strike wood was located. This was a colossal valley, so finding the fiery flame lightning strike wood would be no easy task. Moreover, even if they found it, whether or not they could receive acknowledgement from the source power of heaven and earth was another matter altogether. This was in stark contrast to the true meaning of the Great Tao. Upon obtaining it, no, as long as they could carefully observe it, they could definitely increase their own strength and benefit forever. These prodigies were no fools. Which of them didn't understand this? Let Nyo try, Hu Nyo said as she wiped the blood from the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were filled with a dangerous glint. This toad actually dared to wound her? This truly caused her to feel enraged. Ling Han shook his head and said, Don't. Leave your trump card until later. He strode forward, deciding to use the poisonous fruit of the red-spotted green bamboo. He had already decided on this earlier. If their cooperation were successful, he would continue to hide the poisonous fruit of the red-spotted green bamboo. If it weren't successful, however, he would then use this trump card. After all, it was always best to leave one's trump card until last. In any case, he was intent on obtaining the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter. Meanwhile, the toad didn't take advantage of the situation to attack them. As long as they left that certain area, it would pay them no more heed. It would lazily lie back down to sleep. However, once Ling Han entered that area again, it immediately opened its eyes to stare at him. Show! It leaped forward at an astonishing speed, arriving before Ling Han in a flash. This clearly wasn't teleportation, yet it achieved almost the exact same result. Its blood-red tongue lashed out like a lively spear, aiming to strike Ling Han's face. Pa! This attack was far too quick and far too intense. Ling Han had no time to dodge, and his face was immediately struck. A searing pain instantly shot across his face. It was as if the regulation of slaughter had transformed into a drill that was carving away at his face. Moreover, this was already thanks to the protection of the indestructible Heaven Scroll. Otherwise, this attack would have definitely annihilated his face. Now it's my turn to attack. Ling Han slashed down with his sword, yet he felt absolutely no resistance. As it turned out, he had already been sent flying by the toad's attack. Hu Nyo and the Empress immediately dashed forward to catch him. Ling Han, your face has been smeared with toad spit. So should Nyo kiss you in the future or not? Hu Nyo asked in a vexed voice. If she kissed him, that would seem far too disgusting. If she didn't kiss him, however, how could she endure this? Thus, she felt extremely vexed at this moment. Ling Han could only chuckle bitterly. Couldn't Hu Nyo think about more normal matters? He stood up, and as he gazed at the sleeping toad, he replayed the previous scene in his mind. I need to attack earlier, he said to himself inwardly. Let's go again. He charged forward again. Boom! In the blink of an eye, he was sent hurtling back again, just like before. This time, however, he directly crashed into a mountain wall, causing even the ground to shudder. I attacked too early, so my sword was lacking in power. Again. Boom! 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 Ling Han charged forward 7 times in a row. However, his attack was always either too late or too early. This greatly decreased its might, rendering it unable to penetrate the toad's defenses. In turn, he was unable to poison the toad. The other prodigies were all humored yet astonished by this. Was he here to fight the monster or be analed by the monster? How many times was this? Yet, Ling Han still insisted on charging forward. Moreover, everyone was well aware of the toad's power. Even Shu Yaring didn't dare to face it head-on. Yet, Ling Han was still unscathed after facing it 7 times in a row. Just how terrifying was this? This person is also a freak. There was a glimmer in Shu Yaring's eyes, and she thought to herself, he definitely isn't a celestial king who's toying with reincarnation. However, if he isn't a celestial king, how can he be so powerful? Perhaps he's also a supreme freak. One who can even suppress the reincarnation of celestial kings? Is he the second E? Ling Han shook his head. The toad was far too quick, and its attacks were far too speedy. It was almost impossible to seize that fleeting instant to attack. If he wanted to strike this monster, he would need to make at least several hundred attempts. However, he could only channel the indestructible heavens scroll a limited number of times. He could only channel it a maximum of 3 more times. He needed to succeed soon. I have to use the regulation of time, Ling Han thought to himself. Moreover, he also had to draw on the power of the Black Tower. Otherwise, with his 5th severance cultivation, his power of regulations could rival those at the Yang Soul. It was extremely unlikely that he could wound those at the Heaven Soul. Although this would exhaust his power, his defenses wouldn't be weakened as a result. As such, he didn't need to worry about others seizing the opportunity to attack him. In any case, both Hunyou and the Empress were powerful enough to guarantee their safety. As for Bewitching Maiden Row's battle prowess, Ling Han completely ignored it. Bewitching Maiden Row. I can give it a try. Moreover, I have to succeed. Ling Han strode forward before charging at the stone tablet again. He's charging forward to get analed again. Everyone was already accustomed to this scene, so they all made this remark in their mind. However, they couldn't help but admire Ling Han's courage. Croak! The toad was emotionless, and it didn't lose interest because Ling Han had attacked it too many times. It didn't become angry either. Instead, it charged forward to attack him just like before. Crack! Its tongue lashed out, same as always. Ling Han drew on the power of the Black Tower before as he unleashed a palm strike. Wang! The toad suddenly stopped in its tracks. It hovered in the air in an uncanny manner, yet it quickly regained its ability to move in the very next instant. Continued to dash at Ling Han. Those at the Heaven Soul were far too powerful, and the regulation of time could only freeze them for less than 1/100th of a heartbeat. However, this was already enough time. Ling Han leaned slightly to the side, preventing the toad's attack from striking him head-on. However, because the toad had been frozen for too little time, its tongue still lashed into his body, sending him flying again. It was also at this moment that Ling Han thrust forward with his hand, releasing the Divine Demon Sword. Like a whip, the Divine Demon Sword flew toward the toad. This sword was imbued with Ling Han's full power. Pa! Ling Han was sent flying, and the Divine Demon Sword that carried all of his hopes finally pierced into the toad's body. Success! Everyone was stunned upon seeing this. This was far too astounding. Ling Han was only at the 5th severance, which meant that he was essentially a Yang Soul cultivator facing a Heaven Soul monster. Yet, he had actually managed to wound the toad. This was simply unfathomable. You're definitely a fucking freak. However, many people immediately shook their heads. What did this matter? Even if a Heaven Soul cultivator suffered the full power attack of a Yang Soul cultivator, that would only be but a scratch. To exchange wounds like this, the Yang Soul cultivator would be severely wounded, while the Heaven Soul cultivator would only suffer some minor wounds. After all, only their skin would be scratched, so what great effect could this have? Pa! Ling Han plopped down onto the ground. However, he couldn't help but smile. As long as the Divine Demon Sword pierced the toad's skin, it would definitely die. After all, the juice from the poison fruit could even kill Immortal Palace tier elites. The Empress and Hunyou both walked over to help Ling Han up. As for the Divine Demon Sword, they didn't have time to deal with it at the moment. Pong! 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 Under the watchful gazes of everyone, the toad suddenly started to violently jump around. It was as if it had been put under some kind of curse. It wasn't long before the toad collapsed to the ground, with its spikes powerlessly falling to the ground. A crimson-red stone appeared before everyone. Fuck! It's dead. Everyone was transfixed with shock and disbelief. This was far too unfathomable. Ling Han had simply tossed his sword, so unless it was a genuine and awakened celestial tool, how could it have killed a Heaven Soul monster? This was inconceivable. Simply inconceivable. In the next instant, a dozen or so people immediately dashed toward the divine demon's sword. Regardless of whether it was a celestial tool or not, they would snatch it and run away first. Wowie! Such despicable people! Hunyo roared in anger. She immediately charged forward, shouting, "You people are far too detestable. So be it if you don't thank Ling Han for killing the toad. Yet you're even trying to steal his weapon. Nyo is going to pummel you people to death. Pung, pung, pung." She immediately started to battle against those people. Emperor Tears were no match for her. Yet 3 Monarch Tears had also charged forward to steal Ling Han's weapon. One of them was none other than Fei Yun. Thus, Hunyo couldn't dispose of them easily, especially Fei Yun. Instead, they became engaged in an intense battle. Meanwhile, Ling Han started to rapidly recover his energy. He wasn't in a state to battle right now, so the Empress stood guard beside him. Haha! Since the monster has already been disposed of, the alliance should also be disbanded. A monarch tear from the wide prosperity heavens said with a loud laugh. His expression became cold, and he said, "Trash from the calm peace heaven? Are you not going to fuck off now?" Ling Han's state was clear for all to see. He had already lost the ability to battle. Thus, the only person of concern from the calm peace heaven was Hunyo. Would this not be easy to deal with? A treasure like the true meaning of the great Tao could create a paramount prodigy. Moreover, the wide prosperity heaven and the calm peace heaven were locked in a fierce competition, so those from the wide prosperity heaven naturally didn't want those from the calm peace heaven to comprehend the true meaning of the great Tao. Shameless! Yen Xianlu and the others chided. It was Ling Han who had killed the guardian monster, yet these people were not only taking credit for this, but they were even trying to shoo him away and steal his weapon. This was far too repulsive. "If you don't piss off, then don't blame me for being merciless," a monarch tear from the wide prosperity heavens said in a baleful voice. He was called Yi Linfeng, and he was ranked number 5 in the wide prosperity heaven. He was definitely a top-notch prodigy. "Fight to the death with them!" Many people from the calm peace heaven shouted in anger. First of all, they were truly infuriated. Second of all, the true meaning of the great Tao was far too enticing. Who was willing to abandon this opportunity? Ha 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 ha! Fei Yun roared with laughter as a sword appeared in his hand. He had successfully snatched the divine demon sword. Fei Yun felt extremely smug at this moment. He felt as if he had exacted revenge for everything. Not long ago, Ling Han had used an iron spear to pierce his ass, humiliating him before everyone. Now he had snatched one of Ling Han's precious treasures before everyone, viciously returning the favor. This was amazing, far too amazing. Hunyo stood still and silently glared at Fei Yun. She was like an infuriated lioness, with her long black hair billowing in the air and flames sparking from her eyes. Boom! There was the sound of crashing waves as a colossal rock soared out from behind her. With a flap of its wings and a swish of its tails, a symbol of the great Tao materialized in the air. It was as if this symbol could suppress the heavens. She was truly enraged at this moment. She was going to kill this despicable person at all costs. He was far too deplorable, far too despicable, and far too shameless. However, Fei Yun didn't pay any heed to her. He was slightly weaker than Hunyo, yet his battle prowess still ranked within the top 10. Thus, he wouldn't be much weaker than her. At the very least, he could hold his own without being defeated too quickly. This is forged from devouring metal," he exclaimed in excitement as he examined the divine demon sword. As long as it had enough godly metal to devour, devouring metal would eventually evolve into divine metal. In fact, there were even rumors that the limit of devouring metal wasn't simply divine metal. As long as it had enough divine metal to devour, it could even continue to evolve. Of course, divine metal was extremely rare and valuable, so much so that even celestial kings would drool over them. As such, who would feed it divine metal? In any case, it was without a doubt that the divine demon sword could evolve to become a celestial tool. "I've struck it rich. I've truly struck it rich." Fei Yun roared with laughter. He felt extremely delighted, especially since he had snatched this celestial tool from an enemy's hands. He was beside himself with joy. What? Devouring metal? The other monarch tiers from the wide prosperity heaven were also ecstatic upon hearing this. This was equivalent to obtaining a celestial tool. No wonder Ling Han had killed that heaven soul monster with such ease. As it turned out, his weapon was a future celestial tool. Thus, it was naturally very powerful. However, no one knew that this wasn't because of the divine demon sword. Of course, the divine demon sword had indeed contributed greatly in piercing through the toad's defenses. It was because of this that the juice of the poisonous fruit could enter the toad's body. In their eyes, however, it was the mighty power of the divine demon sword that had killed the heaven soul monster. They definitely had to fight for this weapon. Fei Yun, hand the sword over. That's right, hand it over. It belongs to our wide prosperity heaven. You can't hog it for yourself. Everyone shouted for Fei Yun to hand the sword over. However, how could he? He would rather become the public enemy than hand the sword over. You all deserve to die. Hunyo growled in a low voice. Her fury had already reached an extreme, and an indescribable aura started to erupt from her body. This was an aura that could crush all matter. Fei Yun and the others were astonished upon seeing this. At this moment, Hunyo reminded them of the freak E. Even though there were so many of them, they still couldn't help but feel a cold chill running down their spines. It was as if they had no chance of victory. Ling Han had already recovered some of his energy, so he stood up and said in a calm voice, "Do you people know? Greed can lead to one's death." Heh! Everyone chuckled coldly upon hearing this. Was Ling Han joking? Following his logic, no one should fight for rare treasures. They should all stay at home and do nothing? If you insist on seeking death, then you only have yourself to blame, Ling Han said. He lifted his finger slightly. Whoosh! There was a flash of light as the divine demon sword suddenly started to move by itself, stabbing toward Fei Yun and the others. Fei Yun was extremely startled by this. Only at this moment did he realize that this was still Ling Han's weapon. Even though it had left the latter's hands, the martial intent within it still hadn't been erased yet. Thus, it could still be manipulated by Ling Han. Fei Yun had been far too excited just then. This was his mortal enemy's treasure, and it was more so forged from devouring metal. Thus, he had been over the moon with excitement, so much so that he had forgotten the basics. For example, erasing the martial intent from the weapon and replacing it with his own. Of course, whether or not he could erase it was another matter altogether. A burst of sword light slashed over, and Fei Yun hurriedly grabbed the hilt of the sword in an attempt to parry. After blocking this strike, he would immediately erase Ling Han's martial intent and replace it with his own. He would assert his ownership over this sword. However, as the burst of sword light slashed over, numerous symbols of the great Tao started to materialize and pulsate, triggering a resonance with heaven and earth. This was an overwhelming power. Even though Fei Yun had successfully deflected the attack and stopped it from striking his weak points, he had ultimately failed from blocking the attack completely. First of all, the attack from the divine demon sword had been far too sudden, completely catching him off guard. Second of all, its power had been far too overwhelming. Thus, the attack still left a gash on his leg. Detestable! Fei Yun roared in anger. This was extreme joy begetting sorrow. He hadn't imagined that he would suffer a surprise attack from Ling Han. He humphed and said, "This sword is already in my hands, yet you still want to snatch it back? In your dreams, even celestial kings would be enticed by such a precious treasure. Thus, how could he hand it over?" Ling Han shook his head upon hearing this. After being poisoned by the red-spotted green bamboo, even treatment at the first possible moment might not save the victim. This was not to mention that Fei Yun was still blabbering on and taunting Ling Han. Ling Han naturally wouldn't warn him. He said in a calm voice, "The heavens want to harvest your life, so no one can prevent this from happening. Absolute nonsense." Fei Yun was just about to chide Ling Han, yet he suddenly felt that something was off. An indescribable power suddenly started to wreak havoc inside him, directly surging toward his divine sense. It was brimming with formidable corrosive power. "You!" He pointed at Ling Han, and he was just about to say something else. However, he suddenly stopped speaking, and his entire body started to fall. Yet, before he could hit the ground, his body had already dissolved into liquid. Both his body and divine sense were annihilated. What? Everyone's hair stood on ends. Fei Yun had only suffered a gash to his leg, and this wasn't even a deep gash. In fact, it could only be considered as a scrape. Yet, this had actually killed him, a fifth severance monarch tier. This was too terrifying. With a wave of Ling Han's right hand, the divine demon sword immediately flew back to its owner. Because Fei Yun's death had been far too quick and eerie, not a single person dared to intercept the divine demon sword. They were afraid that they might follow in Fei Yun's miserable footsteps. They could only look on as the divine demon sword returned to Ling Han's hands. Pa! Ling Han caught the divine demon sword and placed it into the Black Tower. He then said in a calm voice, "Fine. Since you people want to disband the alliance, come over and fight." He still had yet to fully recover, yet his voice was filled with confidence and a domineering aura. This fired up the prodigies from the calm peace heaven. They would do battle. What was there to be afraid of? Come on, battle us. See how we beat you bastards to death. The prodigies from the calm peace heaven all roared in fury. This was largely because some prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were far too despicable. Not only had they been ungrateful toward Ling Han, but they had even fought over his weapon. This caused a flame of anger to burn in their chests. Now, Ling Han's words had comprehensively lit the fuse to their anger, causing them to unleash it with ferocity. Forget about it. We're all members of the celestial realm, and we still have a common enemy to fight. It's best that we don't engage in internal conflict and ruin the harmony, Xu Yering said. Ruin the harmony? Yi Linfeng said in a baleful voice. Celestial Maiden Xu, you also saw just then. Fei Yun died a miserable death right before our very eyes. Can we still coexist peacefully with the calm peace heaven? That's right. Prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven can't die for nothing. Moreover, that brat clearly possessed the ability to kill that monster. Yet he purposefully hid his strength at the start. His actions led to the death of many prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. His intentions are absolutely wicked. These people were truly resorting to arguments of twisted logic. Xu Yering frowned upon hearing this. She had a keen eye for the overall situation, yet there were some things that she couldn't say. Thus, she was at a loss for how to persuade them. Battle! With a low roar, Ling Han immediately charged forward. He had already recovered some of his battle prowess, and his defenses were more so invincible. Thus, he didn't need to worry about his safety even though he wasn't in his peak state. Under his lead, Yan Xianlu and the others also charged forward. They had already endured their anger for a very long time. At this moment, they were finally unleashing it all. Xu Yering sighed upon seeing this. With a flash, she arrived before Ling Han. She then reached over with a palm and blocked him, saying, "Brother Ling, please restrain yourself and consider the bigger picture." The bigger picture? Ling Han said with a cold chuckle. You're telling me to consider the bigger picture now? When those people were trying to shoo me away just then, where did your bigger picture disappear to? When they were trying to snatch my weapon, where did your bigger picture disappear to? Say, does your so-called bigger picture only exist when your side isn't enjoying the advantage? Bigger picture your mom. Come, battle. Right now, Ling Han's temper definitely wasn't good. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven had treated him with contempt first, and now they were even trying to screw him over. It would be a miracle if he could endure this. He lashed out in anger, and Hunyo also roared as she unleashed her full battle prowess. A rock materialized in the air, screeching as it beat its wings and released its devastating aura. The Empress was no weaker, and she summoned all 9 of her doppelgangers. They were all monarch tiers, and they all unleashed their own celestial techniques. The 3 of them made up the main force of the calm peace heaven. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, Lao Song, and the others acted as supports. They unleashed some kind of formation, and their battle prowess wasn't weak either. With a long roar, Yi Linfeng led the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven to engage in a ferocious counterattack. The two sides became locked in an intense battle. This was a fight between two heavens, so it was naturally as intense as could be. Both sides detested each other. Contrary to celestial medicines which could only be obtained by a single person, the true meaning of the great Tao could be shared and comprehended by everyone. However, the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven didn't want to share this with the prodigies from the calm peace heaven, and the reverse was also true. The battle became increasingly heated. Even though Xu Yaring tried her best to dissuade everyone, the best she could do was only to prevent deaths on either side. After all, she was only at the 5th severance. In terms of the number of monarch tiers, the calm peace heaven was naturally at a disadvantage. They only had a total of 6 monarch tiers. Meanwhile, the wide prosperity heaven had a total of 11 monarch tiers. However, Ling Han, Hunyo, and the Empress were far too powerful. They stabilized the situation, and they allowed the calm peace heaven to have a chance at victory. Celestial Maiden Shu, stop hesitating. Dispose of those trash. The Emperor tiers from the wide prosperity heaven shouted. Without the formations of monarch tiers, they didn't have the right to participate in this kind of battle. It was during the severing mundane tier that they were the most inferior to monarch tiers. After advancing to the dividing soul tier, they could most likely hold their own. Xu Yaring was still struck with indecision. It was clear that neither side was willing to back down. It was impossible for them to cooperate again. That being the case, it was better for her to act decisively and defeat the prodigies from the calm peace heaven. Otherwise, continuing on like this wouldn't lead to any result. Haha! Is this picking on the outnumbered? Someone said with a loud laugh. A figure suddenly dashed over. Show! With a wave of his hand, he released an indescribably fast arrow at a monarch tier from the wide prosperity heaven. This monarch tier was currently being suppressed by Hunyo, and he seemed to be in a desperate situation. Upon seeing the nearing arrow, he couldn't help but roar and form a celestial seal with his hands. He then grabbed at the arrow. Pa! He caught the arrow, yet the arrow was far too quick. There was a flash of red as blood spurted from his hand. The arrow then slid through his hand and directly pierced his chest. The monarch tier humphed as he frantically shot back in retreat. However, the arrow had already pierced halfway through his chest. Fortunately, he had grabbed the arrow for a brief moment and blocked most of its power. Otherwise, the might of this arrow would have been even greater. He instantly became pale, and his aura started to plummet. The person who had launched the sneak attack was none other than Ji Wuming. The bow in his hands was a genuine celestial tool. Even though its power was limited by his cultivation level, the might of the arrow was still utterly terrifying. Ji Wuming flashed a smile. This was an indescribably sinister and baleful smile. With a flash, he had already appeared behind the wounded monarch tier. You dare! Without even turning around, the monarch tier immediately launched a palm strike. He was a monarch tier, so even though he was wounded, and even though his battle prowess had fallen drastically, his attacks were still brimming with destructive power. Ji Wuming opened his mouth, and a stunning scene ensued. Like a colossal Taotai, his mouth actually widened to an unbelievable size. With a gulp, he then swallowed the monarch tier. The monarch tier had been swallowed whole. A cold chill shot down everyone's spine. This was far too harrowing. That was a mighty monarch tier. Yet, he had been swallowed just like that. Not to mention whether eating people was moral or not, could Ji Wuming even digest this monarch tier? Pong! 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 Numerous fist imprints started to appear on Ji Wuming's abdomen. It was clear that the monarch tier was unleashing his fury inside Ji Wuming's stomach. However, Ji Wuming's stomach possessed terrifying toughness and elasticity, and it wouldn't break no matter what. A smile spread across Ji Wuming's face as he patted his stomach. He then looked toward the others. Wherever he looked, those under his gaze couldn't help but feel a deep sense of apprehension. They felt like Ji Wuming wasn't a person at all. Instead, he was a petrifying monster. Ji Wuming! Xu Yaring roared in anger. She brandished her sword and charged at Ji Wuming. He actually dared to attack members of the wide prosperity heaven before her? Moreover, he attacked a monarch tier with limitless potential, a monarch tier who could definitely become a celestial king. This caused her to become wild with fury. Shua! Her sword slashed down. Ji Wuming simply lifted the bow in his hand to parry. The bow rapidly expanded in size, growing from a foot long to 5 feet long. Clang! He blocked the strike from Shu Yaring. "Why so angry?" he asked in a calm voice. Shu Yaring became even more enraged. Boom! Flames erupted from her silken hair, and her entire body became a raging fireball. She appeared even more dazzling and radiant. With a whoosh, she launched another sword strike at Ji Wuming. However, Ji Wuming simply shook his head and said, "My battle with Tang Minglong already wasted too much time. I don't want to waste any more time on you." With a flash, he escaped from Shu Yaring at an incredible speed. He then grabbed at an Emperor tier. The Emperor tier roared in anger as he counterattacked with his full strength. However, with a simple gulp, Ji Wuming swallowed this Emperor tier into his stomach. To say nothing of others, even Ling Han couldn't help but shed some cold sweat upon seeing this. This person was far too heartless and fearless. He even swallowed living people whole. Of course, he understood that Ji Wuming definitely wasn't swallowing people to satisfy his appetite. Instead, he was doing so to increase his strength or physique. Hunyo crossed her arms and said, "Disgusting!" There was an expression of disgust on her face. Even though she was a glutton, she had never had any interest in eating humans. "Ji Wuming, I'm going to kill you!" Shu Yaring roared as she chased after him. "You already said that once, and I heard you loud and clear. No need to shout it again. You're almost about to burst my eardrums," Ji Wuming said as he picked at his ears. He dashed away again, avoiding any conflict with Shu Yaring. At the same time, he continued to target other prodigies. His bow was far too powerful, and taking advantage of the conflict between the Wide Prosperity Heaven and the Calm Peace Heaven, he continued to target prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven. Moreover, he wouldn't need to launch sneak attacks on Emperor tiers at all. He could directly charge over and swallow them. At this moment, the prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven fell into complete disarray. They lost all intent to battle. Meanwhile, the prodigies from the Calm Peace Heaven were brimming with battle intent. Even though Ji Wuming's action of swallowing people was terrifying, was he not helping them right now? They would seize this opportunity to attack. Only a single person had joined the battle, yet he managed to turn the entire situation on its head. The prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven fled in complete disarray. At this moment, they didn't have the time nor effort to care about the true meaning of the Great Tao. After all, if they lost their lives, what use was a treasure? Ji Wuming suddenly turned to the prodigies of the Calm Peace Heaven and said, "Hee hee, it's your turn now." There was a dangerous glint in his eyes. With a smack, he instantly swallowed an Emperor tier from the Calm Peace Heaven. His eyes were gleaming, and he appeared much like a primordial beast. Ling Han humphed softly before slashing his sword at Ji Wuming. Just then, he had no choice but to battle against the prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven. As such, he hadn't been able to target Ji Wuming. Now that Shu Yaring was also chasing Ji Wuming, he naturally had the freedom to also chase after him. "Brat, it's not your turn yet," Ji Wuming said as he dashed aside. He was like a fish swimming against tumultuous currents. However, regardless of how violent the waves were, he could still swim through them with ease. Ling Han still had yet to recover his full battle prowess, so he couldn't stop Ji Wuming at all. He could only watch on as Ji Wuming opened his mouth to swallow another Emperor tier from the Calm Peace Heaven. "You have something I need," Ji Wuming said as he stopped. He stared at Ling Han and continued, "I have to leave this sumptuous meal until last so that I can slowly enjoy it to the fullest." Ji Wuming had most likely sensed the Shenin source water and the Nine Heavens flame. However, to be able to sense these two source powers while still at the fifth severance, the sensitivity of his divine sense was truly astonishing. Just who in the world is this Ji Wuming? If Ling Han had heard the conversation between Ji Wuming and Tang Minglong, he would have come to a sudden realization. Ji Wuming was the reincarnation of a ninth heaven celestial king. So was it strange that he possessed some abilities that exceeded his cultivation level? In the past, he had been a supreme figure who could wantonly travel through the celestial realm. It would be truly strange if he didn't possess some unique abilities or powers. Ling Han, the Empress, Hu Niu, and Xu Yaring all chased after and attacked Ji Wuming. By teaming up, the four of them were most likely invincible among those at the severing mundane tier. This was indeed the case. Ji Wuming didn't stop to fight with them at all. Instead, he continued to use his movement techniques to evade them and attack others. He was like a slippery fish and he was able to easily avoid their attacks. Even if he couldn't dodge their attacks, he would simply swing his bow to parry. He would then casually stroll over to attack other people. Ling Han and the others could only follow him in vain. They couldn't stop him at all. Ling Han had no option but to place Bewitching Maiden Row into the Black Tower. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel astounded. They were both at the fifth severance, and Ji Wuming's battle prowess wasn't especially strong, either. However, he could somehow manage to toy with all four of them. They couldn't continue like this. Ling Han slowed down his attacks and started to carefully observe Ji Wuming's movements. He gradually made some discoveries. Ji Wuming was indeed at the same cultivation level as them. However, his grasp of regulations had already reached an incredibly refined state. He was well versed with each fine detail, and it was because of this that he could easily dismiss all of their attacks. However, this discovery couldn't help Ling Han at all. After all, he had no way of emulating Ji Wuming. The other party's strength was built upon his profound grasp of regulations, and this was something that could only be mastered through countless years of cultivation. Or perhaps one needed to observe the true meaning of the Great Tao for countless days until they completely mastered the foundations of regulations. Ling Han couldn't help but feel astonished. Looking at Ji Wuming's flame of life, his age was only in the tens of thousands of years. This was very similar to him. However, his grasp of regulations was on a completely different level. The gulf between them was like the distance between heaven and earth. Ling Han was unable to accept this. Were there truly such heaven-defying freaks? They could achieve in a few years what others needed hundreds of millions of years or even billions of years to achieve. One had to realize that Ling Han was already a freak. In any case, if Ling Han knew that Ji Wuming was the reincarnation of a ninth heaven celestial king, he would definitely come to a sudden understanding. Ninth heaven celestial king. Perhaps they had lived for trillions of years, or perhaps they had lived for several epochs. Thus, would it be strange that they possessed such a fine grasp over regulations? The number of people became fewer and fewer. Moreover, no one dared to escape. After all, if they left the protection of Ling Han and the others, they would be easily caught by Ji Wuming, upon which they would be swallowed. However, even if they stayed, Ling Han and the others were still unable to guarantee their safety. They could only delay their inevitable deaths. The Emperor Tears couldn't help but feel grief and vexation. In the outside world, which of them wasn't a mighty and renowned being? Even if they didn't become a celestial king in the future, they could still at least become an ascending origin tier elite. Yet they were actually suffering such a fate. How miserable! Only monarch tiers like Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, Lao Song, and the others could survive. Without the interference of the wide prosperity heaven, they were most likely strong enough to exchange a few strikes with Ji Wuming. Thus, they could hold on until Ling Han and the others rushed over to help them. In just 1 hour, only 7 people remained, not counting Ji Wuming. Moreover, all of them were monarch tiers. "I urge you to give up," Ji Wuming said in a calm voice. "You people can't stop me. Moreover, I don't want to waste my trump cards on you either. Why don't we all sit down to observe the true meaning of the Great Tao? In your dreams." Xu Yaring roared in fury. She continued to ferociously attack Ji Wuming. Ling Han was also brimming with fighting spirit. It was far too difficult to come across such a challenging opponent. Indeed, fighting against Ji Wuming would also bring him many benefits. After all, Ji Wuming was a master in manipulating regulations. As long as Ling Han could grasp the fine details of regulations, his strength would definitely see a noticeable increase. Meanwhile, the true meaning of the Great Tao was a treasure that could help him grasp these fine details. Yan Xianlu and the others also started to attack Ji Wuming. However, Even with 7 monarch tiers attacking him, Ji Wuming still appeared as composed and relaxed as could be. In fact, he would even pose a deadly threat to Shan Jitong and Lao Song from time to time. These two were the weakest among the 7 monarch tiers. In fact, they could barely withstand a single strike from Ji Wuming. Once they were attacked, they would be plunged into a perilous situation of life and death. In just a short moment, the two of them were already drenched in blood. They appeared as miserable as could be. Yan Xianlu wanted to draw the two of them into his spatial god tool. Yet this would be a huge blow to their confidence and dignity. Moreover, this wasn't a secure method either. After all, what if his spatial god tool were snatched by Ji Wuming? At that time, Shan Jitong and Lao Song would face certain death. Thus, with the addition of these 2 monarch tiers, Ling Han and the others' battle prowess fell by a significant amount. They were completely suppressed by Ji Wuming. Both his battle experience and intuition were incredible, and this was most likely the result of having engaged in countless battles. His reactions were extremely natural, and he didn't need to think about them at all. His body would reflexively choose the most suitable action. Ling Han became increasingly puzzled, and he asked, "Who in the world are you?" "Me? A nameless pawn," Ji Wuming replied in a calm voice. He then glanced at Xu Yaring and said, "This is my last time suggesting this. Why don't you stop?" Ling Han was the first to stop. Even though he wanted to defeat Ji Wuming, he truly couldn't find any way to do so. Of course, if this were a one-on-one battle, he wouldn't fear Ji Wuming at all. First of all, could Ji Wuming tear through his defenses? At that time, he could freely unleash the might of his 9 heavens flame and Shenin source water. Most importantly, his battle prowess still had yet to fully recover. At the same time, he couldn't draw on the power of the Black Tower. With Ling Han stopping, the Empress and Hu Niu naturally stopped as well, even though they felt extremely displeased about this. Following them, Yan Xianlu and the others also stopped. Only Xu Yaring continued to attack Ji Wuming. She was beside herself with fury. Beneath the azure mountains, rabbit spirits confused and flustered. Rivers of lightning flow aside, dragons of flood unleash their might. Ji Wuming suddenly said, Why you?" Xu Yaring stammered as her expression changed drastically. Her attacks suddenly stopped, and her slender figure started to tremble uncontrollably. She appeared as emotional as could be. Ji Wuming flashed a smile and asked, "Girl, you're not going to attack me anymore?" "Lord!" Xu Yaring exclaimed as she suddenly fell to her knees, with tears streaming down her cheeks. She was beside herself with emotion. What's going on? This battle has suddenly become a family reunion? Judging by her prostration, Xu Yaring will probably smile and accept her fate even if Ji Wuming wants to kill her. In fact, it seems as if she's Ji Wuming's subordinate. However, as a supreme monarch tier, how can she be someone else's subordinate? Moreover, she clearly didn't recognize him at first. At the very least, not his current identity. Only when he recited those lines did she finally come to a realization and shed tears. This Ji Wuming, who in the world is he? Not only that, but this Xu Yaring most likely has another identity as well. Ling Han frowned and said, "Instead of having a happy little reunion, perhaps you should explain this to everyone?" "You don't have the right to know," Ji Wuming said in a calm voice. He stared at Ling Han, and a golden speck materialized in his eyes. His voice was meaningful as he said, "Apart from 2 source powers of heaven and earth, there also seems to be something else with you. Moreover, its value is even greater, because even I can't see through it." Ling Han was stunned. Just what kind of freak was he? A value even greater than his source powers. Ji Wuming had definitely discovered the existence of the Black Tower. However, Small Tower had once told him that the Black Tower couldn't be discovered unless he used it before Celestial Kings. Of course, this was referring to low-level Celestial Kings. However, Ji Wuming naturally wasn't a high-level Celestial King. Instead, he was only a 5th Severance cultivator. That being the case, how had he discovered the existence of the Black Tower? Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, and the others were also astonished. Ling Han actually possessed two source powers of heaven and earth. These were source powers of heaven and earth, things that were as valuable as divine metal. Even celestial kings could only dream of such treasures. Yet, as a severing mundane tier cultivator, Ling Han already possessed source powers, and two at that. This was inconceivable. Moreover, he even possessed a treasure that was more valuable than the source powers of heaven and earth. What could it be? Yan Xianlu and the others were unable to fathom this. Ling Han composed himself and asked, "Reincarnation of a celestial king?" He wasn't only looking at Ji Wuming, but also at Xu Yaring. Since he suspected Tang Minglong of being a reincarnated celestial king, why couldn't Ji Wuming and Xu Yaring also be reincarnated celestial kings? Ji Wuming shook his head, and it was clear that he didn't want to say anything more. He simply stared at Ling Han with his gleaming eyes, saying, "Something that even I can't see through, such kind of treasure. Ha 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 ha. I have some confidence now." He retracted his gaze before walking up to the stone tablet. He then sat down and started to comprehend it. His actions were bold, and he didn't put up any defenses. However, upon sitting down, his back was like a towering mountain that soared into the heavens. This was a mountain that one could only gaze up at. This was a mountain that no one dared to attack. This was a kind of aura, a profoundly domineering aura. In his previous life, this person was definitely a paramount celestial king, someone who stood at the pinnacle of cultivation, Ling Han said in his mind. He then communicated with Small Tower. "What do you think about this person?" Ling Han asked. "He's extraordinary, very extraordinary," Small Tower said in a cautious voice. This was extremely rare, with Small Tower often being proud and relaxed, and also taking joy in teasing him. It was truly rare that it showed such caution. "His divine fetus is developing toward a state of perfection," Small Tower added. "What does that mean?" Ling Han asked. "A divine fetus is born if one has a celestial king ancestor and their bloodline suddenly returns to this ancestral state, giving them a wisp of celestial king power," Small Tower explained. It was rare that it didn't use this opportunity to scold Ling Han for being ignorant and ill-informed. Whatever regulations the celestial king cultivated is whatever regulations their descendant will obtain. This was very easy to understand. For example, chickens could only lay chicken eggs. If they suddenly laid a duck egg, that would definitely be the work of the duck next door. However, the divine fetus of this person possesses extremely varied and complex powers. Theoretically speaking, it shouldn't be like this, Small Tower said in puzzlement. However, with this person, all kinds of divine fetus powers are fusing together, becoming the foundation of his Tao. It's as if his divine fetus can absorb the Tao of all celestial kings. With the knowledge and wisdom of so many predecessors, you can try to imagine just how profound his foundations are. Why do I urge you to obtain more source powers of heaven and earth before becoming a celestial king? It's so that you can solidify your foundations. That way, you can easily soar to new heights after becoming a celestial king. This person is doing the exact same thing. The celestial king tier is divided into 9 heavens, with each subsequent minor tier allowing one to ascend to a new heaven. However, if one has already grasped all regulations in the world when they advance to the celestial king tier, perhaps they can even kill third heaven celestial kings while still at the first heaven. If this were said in public, perhaps others would treat them as fools. Who didn't know that there existed a strict hierarchy of power in the celestial king tier? Second heaven celestial kings could definitely crush those at the first heaven. This was equivalent to dividing soul tier cultivators pummeling severing mundane tier cultivators. This was like a father beating their son. The son could do nothing but endure the beating. Now, however, someone was claiming that a first heaven celestial king could not only defeat a third heaven celestial king, but they could even kill them. Was this not a hilarious joke? However, Ling Han didn't look like laughing at all. Ji Wuming had definitely been a celestial king in his previous life. Moreover, he had definitely been a high-level celestial king. After reincarnating, was he not aiming to become the most powerful in the world? This was only speculation, yet Ling Han had indeed hit the nail on the head. Ling Han was burning with fighting spirit. He definitely had to defeat this person. He had to defeat him fair and square. He wouldn't borrow the power of the Black Tower, nor would he use something like the red-spotted green bamboo. This person could raise his martial intent to a higher level. That's the right attitude, Small Tower said with a nod. It gave affirmation to Ling Han's intentions. Don't spy on my thoughts. You freak tower. If I weren't connected to your mind, do you think I would want to read your dirty thoughts? Small Tower said in retort. Ling Han ignored Small Tower. He then strode over to the stone tablet and also sat down. He started to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. Under Ling Han's lead, the Empress and Hunyo also walked over. Ling Han then released Bewitching Maiden Ro from the Black Tower. Apart from them, Yen Xianlu and the others all walked before the stone tablet. It was just that Yen Xianlu and the others were still filled with apprehension and caution. They were afraid that Ji Wuming might suddenly leap over and attack them. As if reading their thoughts, Ji Wuming suddenly turned around to flash a smile at them. Ji Wuming and Lao Song almost wet their pants in fright. Meanwhile, Yen Xianlu also leaped up and prepared to defend himself. Ji Wuming turned back around and continued to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. It was as if he were only trying to frighten Yen Xianlu and the others. However, after experiencing this, Yen Xianlu and the others didn't dare to venture any closer. They had to maintain a safe distance from that freak. Otherwise, what would they do if they were eaten? Yet, it was necessary that they walked closer if they wanted to see the true meaning of the Great Tao clearly. With some mysterious power of heaven and earth concealing the stone tablet, they naturally couldn't see the symbols clearly from far away. Yen Xianlu and the others were extremely frustrated by this. Meanwhile, Xu Yaring was like a maid as she respectfully kneeled behind Ji Wuming. This was an incredible sight. Was this still the second most powerful severing mundane tier cultivator of the wide prosperity heaven? Was this still the most beautiful woman of the wide prosperity heaven? After just 3 days, Ji Wuming stood back up. He glanced at Ling Han and said, "Take care. Next time we meet, I'll collect all of your treasures from you." Ling Han opened his eyes and said in retort, "After defeating you, I'll spare your life." In comparison, his words were much more domineering and confident. So what if Ling Han spared his life? Regardless of how he chased and pursued, he would never be able to catch up to Ling Han. Ha 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 ha! Ji Wuming roared with laughter as he confidently strode away. Ling Han turned his gaze to Xu Yaring. Xu Yaring hadn't left with Ji Wuming. Instead, she simply watched him leave with an expression of respect and reverence. Only when he disappeared from sight did she change from kneeling to sitting. At the same time, the confidence and relaxed expression of a supreme prodigy returned to her face. This was the true Xu Yaring. "Lady Xu, who in the world is this Ji Wuming?" Ling Han asked. Xu Yaring smiled and replied, "I'm sure you can guess. He's naturally an extremely mighty person." It was clear that she wasn't willing to talk about Ji Wuming's true identity. Ling Han could only guess. Eighth Heaven Celestial King? He focused on Xu Yaring's expression, and he saw a hint of disdain flash across her eyes. "Ninth Heaven Celestial King," he said in certainty. Xu Yaring didn't say anything. She ignored Ling Han, and she instead started to focus on the stone tablet that recorded the true meaning of the Great Tao. Ninth Heaven Celestial King. Ling Han repeated this in his mind. This was absolutely astonishing. Why did a Ninth Heaven Celestial King need to reincarnate? After all, they were already standing at the pinnacle of the world. Perhaps he desired to suppress fellow Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings and become genuinely invincible, so he resolutely abandoned his paramount cultivation and decided to start from scratch again. Let alone becoming a Ninth Heaven Celestial King. Even becoming a First Heaven Celestial King was filled with obstacles and dangers. Thus, what if he couldn't return to the same height again? After all, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a Celestial King could definitely return to the same cultivation level after reincarnating. Cultivation was a heaven-defying matter in itself, so those who reincarnated to cultivate from scratch would naturally be targeted by the heavens. Their heavenly tribulation would become significantly more difficult. Moreover, who could guarantee that they wouldn't be killed during this process of recultivation? Even Ling Han didn't have the courage to sever his own fruits of cultivation and start from scratch again. After reaching the pinnacle, just how strong would one's willpower need to be to sever their own cultivation? Small tower, is reaching the level of ninth heaven celestial king truly the pinnacle of the celestial realm? Ling Han asked. He refused to believe that Ji Wuming had severed his own cultivation simply to become the most powerful ninth heaven celestial king. After all, with so much time on their hands, ninth heaven celestial kings could definitely mend the imperfections in their cultivation, all the way until they reached a state of perfection. Unless this was to prepare for a foundational transformation and to prepare for a higher cultivation level. As such, there was only a single possibility. That was, the level of ninth heaven celestial king wasn't the true pinnacle of the celestial realm. Small Tower paused for a moment before saying, above ninth heaven celestial kings are the paramount beings of the world, heavenly venerates. Heavenly venerate. Ling Han's heart jumped when he heard this. He suddenly recalled Small Tower referring to the previous owner of the Black Tower as heavenly venerate. Above ninth heaven celestial kings were the paramount beings of the world, heavenly venerates. They were the venerable rulers of the world. What kind of existence is this? Ling Han asked. His mouth felt slightly dry, and he said, after all, ninth heaven celestial kings already enjoy an equal standing with heaven and earth. They're transcendent above the great Tao, and they can manipulate both heaven and earth. With a single thought, they can materialize a clone anywhere in the world. Moreover, this clone possesses a power equivalent to ninth heaven celestial kings. Even if one simply mentions their title, this will still trigger a reaction from heaven and earth, Small Tower said in a leisurely voice. Ling Han composed himself, yet his limbs were starting to feel slightly cold. So, the owner of the Black Tower was a heavenly venerate, yet he passed away. That's correct, Small Tower replied. It didn't ignore Ling Han's question. Instead, it answered him in a frank manner. Even heavenly venerates can pass away. These are beings who are transcendent above the great Tao. Anyhow, no wonder the indestructible Heaven Scroll is so freakishly powerful. It managed to attract both the Nine Heavens Flame and the Shenin Source Water. As it turns out, this is a cultivation technique that's transcendent above the great Tao. However, the more Ling Han learned about the power of heavenly venerates, the more he was unable to fathom how such an existence could possibly die. Even if they wanted to commit suicide, that would probably still be impossible, right? There was no longer any power in the world that could erase such beings. There's no need for you to mull over this now. Raise your cultivation, and you'll eventually understand everything in the future, Small Tower said. Ling Han nodded in understanding. Small Tower was extremely good at keeping secrets, so it would be useless to push for any more information. It was clear that Ji Wuming had severed his own cultivation so that he could aim for the title of Heavenly Venerate. He wanted to reach the true pinnacle of the world. Both his courage and resolve were astounding, so it was no wonder that Xu Yering treated him with such respect and reverence. Hang on, then why did Xu Yering reincarnate as well? Also, what about Tang Minglong? Perhaps they all want to become heavenly venerates. After answering a question, many more new questions arose. This caused him to feel extremely frustrated. Whatever. Forget about it. He returned his attention to the stone tablet. Ji Wuming's grasp of regulations had clearly reached an astonishing height already. As such, he only needed 3 days to completely digest the true meaning of the great Tao recorded on this stone tablet. Ling Han naturally couldn't emulate such a feat. He was genuinely at the severing mundane tier. So he didn't have the experience from a previous life or of several epochs. There was simply no way for him to compete with Ji Wuming. After half a year, Xu Yering also stood up. She glanced at Ling Han, and there was some slight change in her expression. There was a hint of darkness, yet she ultimately didn't do anything. She gracefully descended the mountain. When she turned around, Ling Han also opened his eyes. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. If Xu Yering had attacked him just then, he wouldn't have shown mercy, either. He would have unleashed his full power to kill her. He returned his attention to the true meaning of the great Tao again, continuing to solidify his grasp on the regulation of slaughter. After a full 13 years, Ling Han finally completed his comprehension. However, he still hadn't managed to fully comprehend this true meaning of the great Tao yet. Even so, he had finally managed to commit each symbol to memory. Of course, if one asked him to draw these symbols now, he definitely couldn't do so. These were symbols that could only be perceived by intuition. They couldn't be passed on to another person. Heaven and earth didn't allow this. He had once thought about digging the stone tablet up and placing it inside the Black Tower. However, he had discovered that this was impossible. The stone tablet was connected to the entire mountain, so if he wanted to take it, he would have to take the entire mountain. If this mountain were composed of ordinary rock, Ling Han wouldn't mind taking it. Indeed, he could draw it into the Black Tower with a simple wave. However, this place was far too peculiar, so he couldn't take this mountain at all. As such, he spent a full 13 years to commit the symbols of the Great Tao to memory. Upon seeing Hunyou, the Empress, and bewitching Maiden Ro still comprehending the true meaning of the Great Tao, Ling Han decided to enter the Black Tower first. He started to cultivate under the Reincarnation tree. From this, he could also determine that Hunyou wasn't the reincarnation of a celestial king. Otherwise, with the Tao foundation of her previous life, would she need so long to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao? Under the Reincarnation tree, 700,000 years passed by in a flash. In the outside world, only a mere 20 years had passed. Ling Han exited the Black Tower. He had finally achieved initial mastery of the true meaning of the Great Tao. Indeed, this was only initial mastery, and not comprehensive mastery. Meanwhile, Hunyou and the others were still committing the true meaning of the Great Tao to memory. Ling Han didn't disturb them, and he entered the Black Tower again. He retrieved a piece of Celestial King Bloodstone, and started to compare this with the true meaning of the Great Tao. He continued to mull over the regulation of slaughter. Another 10 years passed in the outside world, and this was equivalent to over 300,000 years under the Reincarnation tree. At this moment, Hunyou and the Empress finally completed their comprehension. They had finally committed the true meaning of the Great Tao to memory. Because bewitching Maiden Ro was still comprehending the stone tablet, Ling Han drew Hunyou and the Empress into the Black Tower first. They started to investigate the regulation of slaughter together. However, Hunyou felt extremely displeased. Why did they have to wait for that stupid bewitching woman? Yet, Ling Han and the Empress didn't say anything, so she could only obediently enter the Black Tower to comprehend the regulation of slaughter. Fortunately, this was a fresh matter for her, so she was extremely keen and excited. She didn't feel bored at all. And thus, another 50 years passed in the outside world. Bewitching Maiden Ro finally stood up. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, and the others had already left more than 20 years ago. This was the gulf between them. Once bewitching Maiden Ro finished her comprehension, Ling Han immediately drew her into the Black Tower so that she could solidify her Tao foundations. Meanwhile, he, the Empress, and Hunyou started to descend the mountain. Counting from the day that Ji Wuming had left, over 80 years had already passed. As such, it was hard to say whether the treasures of the two other peaks had already been taken. Similarly, it was hard to say whether someone had already obtained the fiery flame lightning strike wood, or perhaps it had already escaped from this heaven and earth. The three of them were extremely careful as they descended the mountain. In fact, they were even more alert than before. This was because the gravitational force was far too great. Moreover, they were heading down, so it was even easier to fall by accident. After more than a month, they finally managed to descend the mountain. Are we going to head to the two other peaks now, or are we going to venture further into the valley? The Empress asked. Let's have a look around the two other peaks first, Ling Han replied after pondering for a moment. First of all, the valley is far too large, so without any guidance, we might not find the fiery flame lightning strike would even if we spend 1,000,000 years looking around. Second of all, what if the fiery flame lightning strike wood is on one of the two mountain peaks? Hunyou tugged at Ling Han's hands and said, Then let's hurry up and go. She started to drag him along. After walking for a while, a humanoid monster that had countless spikes on its head suddenly appeared before them. "Let Niu deal with it," Niu exclaimed as she jumped forward. She had only just grasped a small portion of the regulation of slaughter, so she was itching to test it out. "Show!" As a burst of murderous aura transformed into a sword ray as it swept forward. With a crack, the humanoid monster instantly fell apart. It was the Empress who had attacked. "Arg! Detestable! Detestable! Far too detestable!" Niu screamed in anger. "Why are you always stealing Niu's things?" The Empress retracted her finger and said, "Was your name written on the monster's head? So you're allowed to steal my prey because of this?" Niu asked in anger. The Empress forcefully suppressed her smile, and she nodded with a serious expression. She was purposefully messing around with Niu. Sure enough, Niu started to jump up and down in frustration. She was like a small monkey. Ling Han couldn't help but smile. In terms of strength, Niu was indeed slightly superior to the Empress. In terms of intelligence, however, the Empress was far superior to Niu. After all, she had enjoyed the position of an Empress for countless years. As such, she was extremely familiar with all kinds of tactics. All right, stop complaining now. There are heaps of monsters for you to kill here," Ling Han said in consolation. Niu pouted as she clung onto Ling Han. She then stuck her tongue out and made a face at the Empress. It was as if she were looking down on her. The three of them continued forward. Sure enough, another monster appeared before them. This time, however, it was Ling Han who attacked it first. A burst of regulation transformed into a sword light as it slashed forward, instantly killing the monster. "Ling Han, you're also bad. Niu isn't going to play with you anymore." Niu leaned over to bite his ear. Ling Han roared with laughter. He patted Niu's back and said, "There are many more chances ahead." More monsters appeared before them, and Niu finally had the opportunity to attack. The destructive ability of the regulation of slaughter was truly terrifying. Moreover, they had obtained the true meaning of this great Tao, so this elevated the might of the regulation of slaughter by another level. Their cultivation level clearly hadn't increased, yet their power had indeed increased. Sure enough, cultivation level isn't absolute. The stronger one's grasp of regulations, the more powerful their battle prowess. The three of them happily continued forward. They continued to battle with monsters to improve their understanding of this regulation. After all, practice was the key to improving its might. Several days later, they arrived at the foot of the second mountain peak. Like the previous mountain peak, this mountain peak towered into the clouds. Looking up, one couldn't see its summit. They started to ascend the mountain. However, they immediately realized that something was off. Countless different fork roads appeared before them. "How should we advance?" Niu asked. She was completely stumped by this. "Just randomly pick a path," Ling Han said. Since they didn't know which path was correct, they would naturally just pick a random one. The three of them randomly picked a path and continued to advance. Unexpectedly, this was a long and winding path, and after 3 days they discovered that it actually led to a dead end. A cliff appeared before them, and looking down, all they could see was a bottomless abyss. It was as pitch black as could be. They shrunk back and started to walk back the way that they had come, eventually returning to where they had started. They then chose another path which was similarly long and winding. Fortunately, after walking for 2 days, this path forked into 3 more paths. If this path is also incorrect, then picking either of the 3 paths will only cause us to venture further and further along the path of incorrectness. If we blindly advance, we might be stuck here for all eternity. This is most likely a formation. The 3 of them returned to the starting point again. Against a formation, it would be useless no matter how many times they tried their luck. They would only be led into a pit. If they wanted to ascend this mountain, they would have to crack this formation first. They descended the mountain and started to observe it from below. Niu hated using her brains, so it wasn't long before she started to yawn in boredom. She lay down on Ling Han's back and started to sleep. Meanwhile, the Empress and Ling Han started to discuss and exchange their findings. The combined wisdom of 2 people was naturally greater than that of a single person. They continued to enter the Black Tower, where they could use the help of the Reincarnation tree. This was a significant advantage. After only 3 days, they had already come up with a preliminary plan. They had already spent almost 300 years under the reincarnation tree. The three of them started to ascend the mountain again. They chose a path, and after advancing for a single day, this path forked into 2 separate paths. They chose the left path, and after advancing for another day, this path forked into another 3 paths. They chose the middle path. After walking for yet another day, this path forked into 4 separate paths. Just like that, the number of forks in the paths started to continually increase. Eventually, the paths would fork into several hundred or even several thousand paths. However, Ling Han and the Empress weren't astonished by this. Instead, they were delighted. This was completely in line with their deduction. They had indeed chosen the correct paths. A dozen or so days passed, and a figure suddenly appeared before them. It was none other than Yen Xianlu. "Brother Yen!" Ling Han shouted. "Brother Ling!" Yen Xianlu said in greeting as he turned around. "You guys have also come." He didn't know that Ling Han and the others had only used a single year to catch up to him. Otherwise, he would have definitely been shocked to the core. This was because he had spent several years to finally discover a pattern. However, even after arriving here, he still needed to analyze each fork in the path several times before he could determine the correct path. Ling Han nodded in satisfaction. They had already caught up to someone who had set off 20 years ago. As long as the remaining paths were long enough, they still had a chance to catch up to everyone else. After all, the reincarnation tree could provide them with a huge advantage in this kind of situation. It wasn't long before they arrived at a new fork in the path. Ling Han and the others chose a path without any hesitation at all. Ling Han and the Empress were filled with confidence. Meanwhile, Hunyou didn't rack her brains at all. She simply followed their lead. "Brother Ling, don't you need to analyze the situation at all?" Yen Xianlu asked. He had pondered for a moment before hurriedly walking after them. "Ha!" Ling Han rubbed his nose. Hadn't they finished analyzing the situation long ago? Upon seeing Ling Han's expression, Yen Xianlu came to a sudden realization. "It can't be that you've already figured it out, right? So you don't even need to think before choosing the correct path," he exclaimed in astonishment. "It's not the same for you?" Ling Han asked. "Fuck! You're all freaks." Yen Xianlu felt extremely vexed. He felt that it was already a great achievement that he had chosen the correct paths. However, the further he ventured, the more he would need to analyze. As a result, he would also need to spend more time to determine the correct path. Traveling along a path would only take a single day. However, analyzing the forks and determining the correct paths would require several before Ling Han. Yen Xianlu had no option but to admit that there were prodigies more freakish than him in the world. Ling Han's cultivation talent was superior to his, and his battle prowess was also superior to his. In the domain of alchemy, Ling Han more so possessed the potential to become a grandmaster. Right now, even his talent in formations was miles ahead of Yen Xianlu's. How could such a profoundly talented person exist in the world? Following Ling Han and the Empress lead, they didn't need to stop at any of the forks on the path. This naturally increased their speed by a significant amount. 2 months later, several more people appeared before them. This included Xu Yaring and the survivors from the Wide Prosperity Heaven. For example, Lu Jie and his younger sister. Xu Yaring involuntarily furrowed her beautiful brows upon seeing Ling Han and the others. She was slightly astonished. She had been certain that Ling Han and the others would need an exorbitant amount of time to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. Now, however, they had actually caught up to her. What did this signify? This signified that Ling Han and the others could crack this formation far quicker than her. She was completely stunned. Others didn't know, but she was naturally clear that she had been a 7th heaven celestial king in her previous life. Because she had lived for so long, she was naturally well-versed with many different Tao of the world. Now, however, she had actually been beaten by a measly severing mundane tier cultivator. Humph! The prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven all wore unfriendly expressions when they saw Ling Han and the others. Half of the prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven had been massacred by Ji Wuming, while some others had ventured down the wrong paths. They hadn't been able to meet Xu Yaring and follow her. Thus, there were currently only 7 of them in total. "What are you harumphing about?" Hunyo said with a glare. "Who's not happy? Come and fight me." No one answered her. Hunyo's fierceness was already deeply engraved in everyone's mind. Of the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven, only Shu Yering could rival her. As for the others, they were no match for her. Neither side communicated with each other, and it wasn't long before they reached the next fork in the path. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven all stopped in their tracks. With Shu Yering as their leader, they would analyze the situation to determine the correct path. However, Ling Han and the others didn't stop at all. They directly chose a path. Fuck! Shu Yering and the others were stunned. What in the world was going on? Didn't they need to determine the correct path? This was impossible. To determine the correct path with a single glance? What kind of analysis ability was this? Follow them, Shu Yering immediately said. Even if this were the incorrect path, they could still immediately retreat. The memory of Celestials naturally didn't need to be questioned. They activated their movement techniques and immediately followed behind Ling Han and the others. After a day of travel, they arrived before another fork in the path. With the eyesight of Celestials, they could easily determine how many paths there were with a single glance. Coincidentally, there was one more path than the previous fork. In other words, this was the correct path. Had Ling Han and the others guessed correctly? Could there be such a great coincidence? Moreover, was it possible that they had guessed their way up to here? This was far too terrifying. Just what kind of freak was he? However, since this was the case, they would naturally follow behind Ling Han and the others. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were all thinking this. After all, this would help them save some time. After passing several forks, Shu Yering and the others continued to follow behind Ling Han. They were enjoying the fruits of his labor. "Oi! Why are you still following us?" Hunyo asked in displeasure. "Does your family own these paths? Are others not allowed to walk them?" A monarch tier from the wide prosperity heaven asked in retort. He naturally wasn't willing to admit that they were enjoying the fruits of Ling Han's labor. "All right then," Ling Han said with a nod. After arriving at the next fork, he stopped and said, "You guys first." Shu Yering and the others exchanged glances with each other. "Us first." However, they naturally didn't need to back down. They ignored Ling Han and started to analyze the paths. Ling Han snickered before choosing a path. Upon seeing this, Shu Yering and the others hurriedly followed after him. They didn't feel any shame at all. "You people are far too shameless," Hunyo shouted. Ling Han smiled and said to her, "Don't worry. I've got this." Upon arriving at the next fork, Ling Han suddenly grabbed the Empress and the others before activating a movement technique. He surprisingly transformed into 4 shadows, each of which sprinted down a different path. "Ah!" Shu Yering and the others instantly stopped in their tracks. They didn't know which shadow to follow. How was this possible? Ling Han was only at the 5th severance, so even if his cultivation could rival those at the Yang Soul, and even if his battle prowess could suppress those at the Yin Soul, he still wasn't a dividing soul tier elite. Only those at the dividing soul tier could separate their souls to create clones of themselves. It was impossible to tell these clones apart from the actual person. This was far too strange. However, they didn't know that Ling Han had actually taken advantage of the power of time of the Black Tower. He had infused himself with this power, allowing time to slow down by several hundredfold. What looked like an instant to others was much more time for him. During this time, he had sprinted down 4 different paths. To others, however, it was as if he had suddenly summoned 3 clones of himself. What could they do? Did they have to separate? However, what if Ling Han did this again? If they divided the 7 people up into 4 different groups, one group would only have a single person. That being the case, how could they split up again? Forget about it. Let's analyze the paths ourselves. They started to rack their own brains. Ahead of them, Ling Han flashed a smile. "Trying to ride on my coattails?" After walking for a dozen or so days, the path before them finally opened up. There were no more forks on the road, and there was only a wide and magnificent path. At the end of this path was a towering and majestic palace. The four of them walked over, only to discover that this palace was only a shell of its former self. It was in complete disarray. In the past, this had definitely been a spectacular structure. The size was absolutely astonishing. Now, however, not even a single blade of grass could be found. All that was left was broken and naked stone. In a gigantic plaza, there rested a towering stone tablet. Engraved on it was a dense array of words. Right now, a short man was standing before this stone tablet. His hair was white, and he wore an expression of slight concentration as he gazed up at the stone tablet. However, he immediately turned around when Ling Han and the others arrived behind him. Was this not Tang Minglong? He hadn't gone to the mountain peak on the left, and he had instead directly come here. If Ling Han had known that Tang Minglong had fought with Ji Wuming before, he could have guessed that he hadn't gone to the mountain peak on the left because of Ji Wuming. Now, however, he couldn't help but feel slightly curious. Why had Tang Minglong come here first? One had to realize that the left mountain peak was the closest to the entrance. Even though the central mountain peak was in the center of the valley, it wasn't actually facing the entrance directly. Who would have thought that you guys would arrive here first? Tang Minglong said in emotion. He was well aware of Shu Yaring's background. Yet, this reincarnated celestial king had actually been surpassed by a few juniors. He couldn't help but feel surprised. Ling Han simply smiled in reply. If others didn't target him, he wouldn't target them either. He walked over to observe the stone tablet. Heaven destroying 9 swords. For words immediately surged over from the stone tablet. In fact, they transformed into 4 streaks of light. No, for bursts of sword chi. As they slashed down at Ling Han. Boom! Ling Han raised his arms to block. Screech! He was immediately pushed back by the overwhelming power of the sword chi. Thud! 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 He retreated several hundred steps before finally coming to a stop. At this distance, the words on the stone tablet instantly became blurry. He could only determine that there were words engraved into it. Heaven destroying 9 swords? Ling Han murmured to himself as he stood there. A smile spread across his face, and he said, "So, this means that if I can't stand closer to it, I don't have the right to practice this sword technique?" The Empress, Hunyou, and Yen Xianlu also wore expressions of eagerness. Prodigies would seldom admit defeat. Ling Han released Bewitching Maiden Ro from the Black Tower as well, and the 5 of them all walked toward the stone tablet. Wang! Flashes of sword light slashed over again. However, Ling Han was prepared this time, and he immediately waved his right hand, launching a counterattack at the flashes of sword light. He wasn't reactively defending. With Ling Han's example, the Empress and the others also emulated his actions. They all unleashed powerful celestial techniques. Pong, 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 pong. There were flashes of brilliant light as the first wave of attacks from the stone tablet ended. Even though they had been prepared, they were still sent sliding back far into the distance. None of them had managed to advance. These flashes of sword light were extremely overwhelming and powerful. However, even though they had all been pushed back, the distance that they had been pushed back was different. For example, Ling Han had been pushed back the least. This time, he had only been pushed back 200 or so steps. After him was Hunyou, who had been pushed back a dozen or so steps more than him. After her, the Empress had been pushed back 7 more steps. Yen Xianlu fell a further 20 or so steps behind. Last was Bewitching Maiden Ro, who had been pushed back a whopping 600 steps. It was because Ling Han had already faced this attack once that he had been pushed back the least. Discounting him, the strength of the others was clear for all to see. "Come again!" Hunyou shouted in excitement. She immediately dashed forward. Ling Han and the others also charged forward again. Pong, pong, pong. Each time they charged forward, they would be pushed back by the attacks of the stone tablet. However, Ling Han, Hunyou, and the Empress were being pushed back a shorter and shorter distance. In other words, they were continually advancing with each charge. Meanwhile, Yen Xianlu and Bewitching Maiden Ro were also advancing. However, their advance was incredibly slow, especially Bewitching Maiden Ro's. Tang Minglong involuntarily stroked his beard upon seeing this. His wrinkles became less bunched together, and it was as if he were feeling extremely delighted. It was not in vain for me to battle against that person and exhaust several of his trump cards. When these young ones grow up, they'll definitely become the main pillars to resist the storm of darkness, he said in his mind. At this moment he suddenly clutched at his chest. His body shuddered, and his face instantly became as white as a sheet. Blood seeped from his fingers. Even after reincarnating and recultivating, and even though we're both at the 5th severance, the gulf between him and me is still so great. Who would have thought? I didn't die while battling against the storm of darkness, yet I'll actually die here. So be it. I can lay to eternal rest in my homeland, so I can at least die with a smile. Moreover, as long as these youths can grow up, what does it matter even if I die? Did I not battle in that place for countless years to protect this piece of land? He turned around, preventing Ling Han and the others from witnessing his miserable state. With a leap, he quickly vanished without a trace. Just like Ji Wuming had said before, it was impossible for Tang Minglong to kill him. Meanwhile, he would only need to exhaust a single trump card to kill Tang Minglong. However, Ji Wuming had clearly miscalculated, and he had ended up exhausting more than one trump card. This was also why Ji Wuming hadn't targeted Ling Han just then. Even though he knew that Ling Han possessed some incredible treasure, he had expended far too many trump cards, so it would have been impossible for him to suppress Ling Han. He hadn't spared Ling Han out of goodwill. Ling Han glanced over, and he couldn't help but feel surprised. Tang Minglong left just like that? He wasn't aware of what had happened before, so he simply thought that Tang Minglong had arrived here earlier and already mastered this sword technique. Thus, he didn't pay much heed to this. If others didn't provoke him, he naturally wouldn't provoke them either. Ling Han returned his attention to the stone tablet. Shio, shio, shio. Bursts of sword light slashed over again. Ling Han humphed as he extended his right hand and counterattacked with the regulation of slaughter. Pong, 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 pong. This was a fierce exchange, and Ling Han continued to slide back. However, he only retreated 7 steps in total before stabilizing himself. He then launched a ferocious counterattack as he pushed forward with determination. He could already resist the full might of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. At the very least, he could resist the might of these 4 words. This sword technique was incredibly powerful, and it was more so created on the foundation of the regulation of slaughter. Ling Han was delighted upon discovering this. This was because he already had a solid grasp of the regulation of slaughter, and he had also obtained the true meaning of the Great Tao just then. In the future, he could definitely obtain a comprehensive grasp of the regulation of slaughter. Combined with the heaven-destroying 9 swords, he could definitely unleash the full might of the regulation of slaughter. Moreover, just the words heaven-destroying 9 swords alone could already allow Ling Han to taste a powerful sword intent, as well as a certain influence from the regulation of slaughter. He had a feeling that he could also unleash such a sword technique. Enlightenment instantly arose in his mind. The words on this stone tablet were not for one to comprehend. Instead, these words would directly transform into attacks to battle against those who arrived before them. In this way, one could comprehend the heaven-destroying 9 swords through actual battle. If one wasn't strong enough, they would end up being trapped in the outer regions. If that were the case, they could only settle for comprehending the words, heaven-destroying 9 swords. Interesting. Then let's test out how powerful the following sword technique is. Ling Han stepped forward. This time, the second row of symbols of the stone tablet lit up. Shio, shio, shio. These symbols transformed into 7 swords that slashed over, and each of them was brimming with a murderous aura. It was as if they lusted for blood. Ling Han reached over to counterattack. He didn't draw on the power of the Black Tower, and he was instead relying on his own strength. Ding, 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 ding. There was a series of crisp clanking sounds. During this exchange, bursts of sword light soared into the sky, severing the clouds and seemingly aiming to shatter the heavens. Ling Han was forced to retreat again. This was only the second row of symbols, yet its might was already several times greater than that of the first. As such, he had underestimated it, and this had resulted in him being pushed back further than anticipated. "Ha! Come again!" Ling Han immediately charged forward again. Boom! Flames burst from his body, and it was clear that he had already activated the power of his divine fetus. This elevated his battle prowess by a significant amount. Wang! The attacking swords shuddered, and it was as if they had been enraged. They started to frenziedly slash down at Ling Han. Ling Han continued to resist. With the 9 heavens flame dancing around him, it was as if he were an indestructible god of fire. When he punched, it was as if he could combust the entire heaven and earth. His might was formidable and domineering. However, the heaven-destroying 9 swords wasn't weak, either. It became locked in a ferocious battle with Ling Han. Boom! 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 This was a strange battle, and it was hard to determine who was enjoying the advantage. Only bursts of devastating light continued to soar into the sky, continuously exploding like fireworks. At the same time, symbols of the Great Tao also continued to materialize and explode, with their destructive power simply overwhelming and astonishing. After battling for almost 7 days, Ling Han finally gained the upper hand. He slowly walked forward, forcefully pushing the sword attacks back as he did so. However, when he reached some limit, the second row of symbols suddenly dimmed down. Surprisingly, however, the third row of symbols didn't light up. It was as if the stone tablet were malfunctioning. What's going on? Did the ancient battle between the celestial kings damage the stone tablet? Ling Han stroked his chin in thought. He then glanced over at Hunyou and the others. Right now, Hunyou and the Empress had also entered the second region, meaning that they were also facing the attacks from the second row of symbols. Hunyou was unleashing her rock secret technique, while the Empress had summoned all 9 of her doppelgangers. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu was still in the first region. However, he was already on the verge of entering the second region. As for Bewitching Maiden Ro, she was still far behind him. She was essentially still stuck at the starting point. A thought suddenly occurred to Ling Han. He retreated before charging forward again. Shio. Sword attacks swept over, carrying with them a tumultuous aura of murder. Ling Han drew his divine demon sword and activated the sword technique that he had learned just then, the first technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Something's changed. Ling Han immediately made a discovery. Even though the attacking swords were still as powerful as before, it was as if their hostility toward him had decreased by a slight amount. They had become slightly gentler. Ling Han came to a sudden realization. This stone tablet was indeed here to pass down the heaven-destroying 9 swords. However, after passing the second region, why wasn't the third row of symbols lighting up? This was because the stone tablet was teaching him the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, wasn't it natural for him to resist using the heaven-destroying 9 swords that he had just learned? Sure enough, once Ling Han started to use heaven-destroying 9 swords, even the attacks from the second row of symbols started to become more gentle. It was like a teacher guiding their disciple. No matter how fierce this teacher seemed, it was simply being strict with its own disciples. With this realization, Ling Han turned around and said to the Empress and Hunyou, "Resist using the heaven-destroying 9 swords that you've just learned." Both of them were smart people, and they more so held absolute trust in Ling Han. Thus, they immediately did as he said. However, this was a sword technique that they had only just learned, so how much of its might could they truly unleash? Even though the attacks from the second row were gentler now, Ling Han and the others were still pushed back further and further. Ling Han was completely unfazed. He simply unleashed the first technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords as he also mulled over it in his mind. As he retreated, his grasp over the heaven-destroying 9 swords also became stronger and stronger. In fact, there were even times when he would retreat into the distance to enter the Black Tower, where he would ponder under the Reincarnation tree for a while before coming back out. The Empress and Hunyou also did the same. 7 days later, the 3 of them passed through the second region at almost the exact same time. Wang. The third row of symbols lit up, materializing into 3 sword-wielding people. Without any nonsense, they couldn't speak anyway. These three people immediately charged over and attacked. Sure enough, this was the correct method. Ling Han laughed heartily as he brandished his divine demon sword and unleashed the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Clang, clang, clang. Swords clashed, releasing a crisp clanging sound even though Ling Han was clearly fighting against a projection. This was a clash of the great Tao, a clash which could shake both heaven and earth. This was a ferocious battle. Like before, Ling Han and the others would fight for a while before stopping for a while. Occasionally, they would also enter the Black Tower to further comprehend the sword techniques. One day in the outside world was equivalent to 100 days of deep thought under the reincarnation tree. Coupled with their smarts, their progress was naturally shooting forward in leaps and bounds. When they reached the 5th region, Yan Xianlu had only just entered the 2nd region. Meanwhile, Bewitching Maiden Row was still stuck in her original spot, unable to advance a single inch. This was the gulf between them. Ling Han would occasionally glance back to check on her progress, and he couldn't help but sigh in his mind. Bewitching Maiden Row had initially been a king tier. After obtaining the help of the heavenly Tao Jade, she had mended her path of cultivation and advanced to become an emperor tier. Moreover, she had become a top-notch emperor tier. Yet, even top-notch emperor tiers surprisingly didn't have the right to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. At most, they could only learn the first technique. The celestial king who created this sword technique had definitely been an extremely proud being. In his mind, only monarch tiers had the right to inherit his sword technique. As for other also-rans, he would rather this sword technique be lost than be inherited by them. Moreover, this was definitely a high-level celestial king. 7th heaven? 8th heaven? 9th heaven? Ling Han became increasingly astonished. He had already come across several reincarnations of celestial kings. In other words, there was a significant chance that many celestial kings would still die. This was completely different from his expectation of the celestial realm. In his mind, celestial kings should have been eternal and indestructible. He forcefully suppressed the puzzlement in his mind. Right now, his most important task was to master this sword technique. In any case, his questions would eventually be answered following his advance in cultivation level. As he pushed forward, the projections summoned by the stone tablet became increasingly powerful. In turn, it also became increasingly difficult to master the heaven-destroying 9 swords. During his 3rd year here, Ling Han suddenly stopped to glance back. Someone else had come. It was Xu Yaring and the others. They had finally finished analyzing the paths and found the correct route to reach this place. However, it was a shame that just a few forks in the path had delayed them by over 2 years. The gulf between them and Ling Han was far too large. This was also a direct reflection of the reincarnation tree's incredible usefulness. This was the impressive nature of the source powers of heaven and earth. Upon seeing Ling Han, expressions of anger spread across Xu Yaring's and the others' faces. If they had followed Ling Han, they could have arrived here over 2 years ago. Would they have needed to waste so much time? Ling Han only needed to lead the way. Would that bring him any loss? Was there any need for him to be so petty? They were merely considering this problem from their own point of view. As a result, they started to feel aggrieved and wronged. However, why didn't they consider this from Ling Han's point of view? Why did he need to bring them here? Not to mention that they were fighting for treasures in a mystery realm. They would at least need to thank him for pointing out the correct path even in the outside world, right? Ling Han simply replied with a smile. He had no time for these people. Anyhow, Xu Yaring and the others naturally noticed the stone tablet as well. They hurriedly walked over to start battling with the heaven-destroying 9 swords. However, it was a shame that only Xu Yaring had obtained the true meaning of the great Tao pertaining to the regulation of slaughter among them. Thus, how could they possibly hope to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords through simple battle? Of course, this was unless they possessed heaven-defying talent and aptitude. Otherwise, it was simply impossible for them to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Even so, they were still unwilling to give up. After all, this was a paramount sword technique, so how could they abandon it just like that? Thus, they continued to persist with their futile struggle. Ling Han turned his attention back to the battle at hand. Even though the humanoid projections looked ferocious, they were actually very good teachers. Time and time again, they continued to fully exhibit the complete essence of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Another year passed, and even bewitching Maiden Ro saw a significant improvement, finally advancing to the 2nd region. However, apart from Xu Yaring, the rest of the newcomers all remained stuck in the 1st region. Living up to her name as the 2nd greatest prodigy of the wide prosperity heaven and her status as the reincarnation of a celestial king, Xu Yaring had already advanced to the 3rd region, rivaling the progress of Yan Xianlu. At this time, however, Ling Han, the Empress, and Hunyo had already been battling in the 8th region for a very long time. Once they passed this region, they would be able to learn the final technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Boom! Ling Han was the first to enter the 9th region. As he swung his divine demon sword, a humanoid projection was viciously obliterated from existence. A boundless murderous aura emanated from his body, and with a confident stride, he finally entered the 9th region. However, the 9th row of symbols didn't light up. What's going on? Ling Han was slightly surprised. He had clearly arrived here by using the heaven-destroying 9 swords, so why was there no reaction from the stone tablet? He observed the stone tablet carefully, and he finally discovered that the 9th row of symbols was incomplete. It was damaged by someone? He glanced over it again, and he immediately shook his head. The stone tablet hadn't been damaged by anyone. Instead, it was incomplete in the first place. Perhaps the Celestial King hadn't been able to create the 9th technique. Or perhaps he had suddenly changed his mind while carving the symbols for the 9th technique. Without the willpower of a Celestial King, the 9th row of symbols was dull and lifeless. Moreover, it looked like a jumble of meaningless scribbles. Ling Han had no option but to stop. It was also at this moment that the stone tablet suddenly collapsed with a resounding boom. It was as if it were laying to eternal rest after successfully imparting its inheritance. All of the sword light and humanoid projections instantly vanished. What did you do? A monarch tier from the wide prosperity heaven roared at Ling Han. He was called Ma Lugong, and he was ranked 8th among the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. What did I do? Ling Han rubbed his nose. This person was clearly blaming him for the collapse of the stone tablet. Although this was likely true, it was not something of his explicit doing. Instead, it was a result of the Celestial King's decision. Once someone mastered the 8th technique, the stone tablet would automatically crumble. As such, what did this have to do with him? Not to mention that he didn't know about this. Even if he did, was there any obligation for him to stop? Did he need to wait for them to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords? What an absolute joke. Don't blame me for demeaning you, but you trash couldn't have mastered this sword technique anyway, Ling Han said in a serious voice. Ling Han truly wasn't deprecating them. Rather, without learning the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter, it was genuinely impossible for these people to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. They would merely be wasting their time. This had nothing to do with talent. Of course, this was unless one possessed heaven-defying talent. You! The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were enraged upon hearing this. Not only had Ling Han destroyed the stone tablet and prevented them from learning the sword technique, but he was even calling them trash. Ling Han smiled and said, "What? You're not resigned to this? Then come. See how I pummel you people." The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven faltered upon hearing this. They then looked toward Xu Yaring. Of everyone present, only Xu Yaring could rival Ling Han. However, Xu Yaring remained silent. After all, Ji Wuming had already said that he would personally take Ling Han's life. Thus, let alone targeting Ling Han, she might even help him if he were facing a life-threatening situation. A wide grin spread across Ling Han's face. He wouldn't be afraid even if Xu Yaring truly targeted him. During their battle with Ji Wuming, he had already observed her battle prowess clearly. At most, she was only as powerful as him. Of course, this was ignoring any trump cards that she might have. He swept his gaze over Ma Lugong and the others and said, "As men, it's best for you not to rely on a woman. If you have balls, then come at me." Ma Lugong jumped forward and said, "Do you really think you're invincible?" He knew that he was no match for Ling Han. However, exchanging 10 or 100 blows with him shouldn't be any problem at all. Thus, he decided to exchange a few blows with Ling Han. After winning some face back, he would then retreat and leave. Ling Han immediately shot forward. Whoosh! Like a bolt of lightning, he instantly appeared before Ma Lugong. He then reached over to grab at his face. "Impudence!" Ma Lugong roared. He replied with a palm strike of his own. "You're indeed stronger than me. However, you still can't underestimate me like this." A smile of ridicule tugged at the corners of Ling Han's lips. Drawing on the power of the Black Tower, he immediately activated the power of time. Ma Lugong's movements instantly slowed down. Time was flowing at a slower pace. With Ling Han's current power, he simply needed to decrease Ma Lugong's speed by a limited amount. Reaching over, he easily grabbed onto Ma Lugong's face and directly lifted him up. He faced no resistance at all. Fuck! A cold chill ran down the spines of the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. Ma Lugong was the 8th-ranked monarch tier of the wide prosperity heaven. Even though he was no match for the top 3 freaks, was ranking inside the top 10 not freakish enough already? Yet, he couldn't even withstand a single strike from Ling Han. Had Ling Han been this powerful before? Ling Han was naturally using this opportunity to assert his might and dominance. Otherwise, it would be beneath him to draw on the power of the Black Tower to target a weakling. Pitch. Ma Lugong started to thrash about, yet this was in absolute vain. His face was filled with fury and embarrassment. As a mighty monarch tier, he had actually been captured in a single exchange. This made him look like a complete fool for what he had said before. This was utterly humiliating. If you're so weak, then obediently stand aside. Don't charge into your own death, Ling Han said in a baleful voice. He was radiating with ice-cold killing intent. Ling Han, release him, Xu Yaring chided. She wouldn't attack Ling Han. But this didn't mean that she would remain indifferent to him killing prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. Ling Han glanced at her and said in a calm voice, "Do I know you? Don't test my patience." Xu Yaring replied with an ice-cold expression. Crack. With a tightening of his grip, Ling Han instantly snapped Ma Lugong's neck. Ma Lugong shuddered for a moment before falling completely limp. So what if he was a monarch tier? He only had one life. You! Xu Yaring was wild with rage. Boom! Her silky black hair started to billow even though there was no wind. She was burning with flames of fury. Ling Han clasped his hands behind his back and said, "You what? Do I owe you anything? Don't command me to do this and that. I can do whatever I want." Xu Yaring clenched her hands into fists. If she'd still possessed the power of celestial kings, she would have instantly captured Ling Han. At that time, she would have complete authority over his life. Now, however, there was nothing she could do. "Leave!" She gritted her teeth and growled. The stone tablet had already been destroyed, so there was no point staying on this second mountain peak any longer. A feeling of grief and sorrow welled up in the hearts of the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. As they looked at Ling Han taking the spatial god tools from Ma Lugong's body, they were completely powerless to stop him. They could only turn around and leave. Boom! A ball of 9 heavens flame burst forth from Ling Han's hands, incinerating Ma Lugong's corpse. With Ma Lugong's death, the animosity between them also vanished. Thus, Ling Han would allow him to peacefully return to the embrace of heaven and earth. Nyo leaped onto Ling Han and said, "Bad Ling Han." Nyo was only a step away from mastering the 8th technique. Ling Han chuckled and said, "No worries. I'll teach you guys in the future." The stone tablet had indeed disappeared. However, he had already obtained the full inheritance of the 8 sword techniques. After reaching a certain height, perhaps he could even create the 9th technique by himself. "I definitely can," Ling Han said in his mind. He had obtained the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter, and he had also learned the first 8 techniques of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, as long as he completely mastered these, creating the 9th sword technique would only be a matter of time. Brother Ling, I'm also relying on you, Yan Xianlu said shamelessly. The heaven-destroying 9 swords was incredibly powerful. After all, this was a technique that was built on the foundation of the regulation of slaughter. Before reaching the level of Celestial King, this technique was even stronger than those of the 5 elements and the regulation of lightning. Ling Han chuckled in reply. He didn't agree or disagree. If he had time, he wouldn't mind teaching Yan Xianlu. However, he was an extremely busy person, so it was impossible for him to remain in a single place for an extended amount of time. Thus, he didn't dare to make any promises. Fortunately, Yan Xianlu was only saying this in passing. Each person had their own opportunities and destiny, so this wasn't something that could be obtained by force. They started to descend the mountain. Ascending the mountain had been extremely difficult, yet descending it was as easy as could be. They could all remember the path that they had taken to get here, so descending was naturally a piece of cake. They headed toward the 3rd mountain peak. To their astonishment, the 3rd peak was incredibly easy to ascend. There was no powerful gravitational force, nor was there any maze to navigate. There was no monster to block their path either. Thus, it only took them 7 days to reach the peak of this mountain. In reality, however, they hadn't reached the true peak of the mountain. This was because the mountain peak was cut off midway. Even so, it was still unbelievably tall. In any case, it was no wonder that there hadn't been any obstructions or difficulties. As it turned out, this mountain peak had already been annihilated. It was most likely damaged during the battle between the Celestial Kings. How astonishing! I truly wonder how astounding that battle was. I truly want to witness a battle between Celestial Kings. They all sighed with emotion before turning around to leave. Right now, there was only a single thing left for them to find. The fiery flame lightning strike wood, a source power of heaven and earth. However, this valley was so incredibly large, so how would they find it? Then, let's just casually stroll around, Ling Han said. The Empress, Hunyo, and bewitching Maiden Ro naturally wouldn't oppose this. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu decided to split paths with them. First of all, he didn't want to interrupt Ling Han and his family. Second of all, they were looking for the fiery flame lightning strike wood, and this was completely up to each person's luck. This wasn't determined by strength. One of the annoying people has finally left. However, the other one is still here, Hunyo said as she looked at bewitching Maiden Ro. However, bewitching Maiden Ro was extremely thick-skinned, and she didn't pay any heed to this. This caused Hunyo's eyes to glint with anger again. The 4 of them started to casually stroll around. In this colossal valley, they truly didn't know where to go. Perhaps they might have to wait here for several hundred years, or even several thousand years. Fortunately, the 3 Blooms Valley had no limit on how long they could remain. There was no rule that they had to leave after a certain number of years, or risk facing a fatal punishment. This allowed them to stroll around at a leisurely pace. However, for a source power of heaven and earth, this was completely worth it. The valley was crawling with monsters that were filled with spikes. However, to Ling Han and the others, these monsters weren't an annoyance. Instead, they were a source of treasures. They possessed Celestial King bloodstones that contained the regulation of slaughter, and these were treasures that were as valuable as a city. In the blink of an eye, 7 years had already passed. Ling Han and the others hadn't wasted this time, and they had instead used it to strengthen their grasp of the regulation of slaughter and the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Crack! A bolt of lightning suddenly descended from the sky, giving Ling Han and the others a fright. This bolt of lightning had descended far too suddenly. Moreover, its might was overwhelming, and just its aura alone was enough to chill one to the core. At the very least, Ling Han was certain that he would have been killed if he had been struck by this lightning. "This is heavenly tribulation," Ling Han exclaimed. Even though this bolt of lightning had descended from above them, it had eerily avoided them in a mysterious manner. There could only be a single reason. This was heavenly tribulation, and it would only target a certain individual. Thus, as long as others didn't interfere, it wouldn't attack them regardless of how close they were to the target. Of course, if heavenly tribulation sent shards of rocks flying everywhere, the heavens naturally wouldn't take responsibility for those who were wounded by these rocks. However, none of them had ascended to the next level, so why was heavenly tribulation suddenly descending? Moreover, it was such a devastating heavenly tribulation. Fiery flame lightning strike would, they exclaimed in unison. Only this wondrous matter would attract tribulation after tribulation. If it weren't being blazed by flames, it would be suffering the wrath of lightning. Thus, this sudden and unexpected heavenly tribulation could only point to a single thing. It was almost certain that the fiery flame lightning strike would have been struck by lightning again. Just then, they had only witnessed a sliver of the shock wave. If that's the case, they looked up, only to see a vast expanse of clouds and mists. Ling Han took a deep breath and gathered all of his strength. He then drew his divine demon sword and unleashed a slash at the sky. Boom! A burst of sword light arced through the sky, brimming with a tumultuous and murderous aura. The clouds and mists were violently ripped apart, revealing an expanse of clear blue sky. As if they possessed life, however, the clouds and mists started to rapidly squirm and fuse, causing the sky to become gray and hazy again. However, that short instant was already enough for Ling Han and the others to see clearly. There was an indescribably colossal tree in the sky, and they were currently standing under the crown of this tree. No wonder an arc of lightning had crashed down. As it turned out, they were standing right under the fiery flame lightning strike wood. This was truly a case of looking for light under a lamp's shadow. They had been searching for the fiery flame lightning strike wood right under its shade. Judging by the shape of the tree's crown, the main trunk should be over there, Ling Han said as he pointed in a certain direction. Let's go. The four of them set off in that direction. Surprisingly, it took them 7 entire days to finally arrive before a pitch-black wall. Standing before this wall, one would realize that this wall wasn't entirely straight. Instead, there was a slight curve to it. More precisely, this was a circular wall. However, it was far too large, so from close up it looked much like a flat wall. This was the fiery flame lightning strike wood. When they finally discovered that they were standing under the crown of the tree, perhaps they had already been traveling under it for several days. Yet, they had still needed to spend another 7 days to finally reach the base of its trunk. This was a direct reflection of the colossal nature of this tree. With the trunk of the tree being so colossal, could the crown of the tree be small? Ling Han reached over to place his hand on the tree trunk. Crackle! An arc of white lightning immediately shot over. Pong! Ling Han was sent flying back. Hunyo hurriedly ran over and asked, Ling Han, are you okay? I'm fine, Ling Han replied as he picked himself up. Even though he said this, his entire body was still trembling. The arcs of lightning on this fiery flame lightning strike couldn't be underestimated. Even though they weren't powerful enough to kill him, they could still cause him to tremble uncontrollably and make him feel extremely uncomfortable. Come, everyone give it a try. Let's see who can obtain this source power of heaven and earth, Ling Han said. Ling Han wanted to obtain this fiery flame lightning strike wood, yet he definitely wouldn't be greedy about it. He would give others a chance to try their luck. In any case, source powers of heaven and earth could only be obtained by those fated to it. The Empress and the others all nodded in reply. They distanced themselves from each other before facing the fiery flame lightning strike wood. Regarding how to obtain this treasure, this was completely up to each individual. Moreover, this was an extremely rare opportunity. After all, who knew when this fiery flame lightning strike might soar through the sky and tunnel through the earth to leave? Ling Han also walked over, channeling the indestructible heaven scroll as he did so. Since this was a heavenly venerable tier cultivation technique, one which was transcendent above all Tao, it would theoretically be very attractive to source powers of heaven and earth. Wang! All four of them lit up with a brilliant glow. Symbols of the great Tao started to materialize on their bodies, yearning to achieve resonance with the fiery flame lightning strike so that they could receive its acknowledgement. However, the fiery flame lightning strike remained completely unresponsive. It was much like an ordinary tree, to which any expression and effort from them would be futile. However, Ling Han and the others didn't give up. As long as the fiery flame lightning strike remained here, they would still have a chance. In any case, How could a source power of heaven and earth be so easy to obtain? They continued to try. Several days passed, and a dense pattern of veins surprisingly started to glow on the tree. There's a reaction. Ling Han and the others were delighted. They started to hurriedly pour more effort into their attempts. Show! A streak of light suddenly slashed over from behind them. Ling Han humphed before jumping up and replying with a fist. Pong! The streak of light instantly shattered into pieces. However, the veined patterns on the fiery flame lightning strike would also stopped glowing. At the same time, the tree and earth also shuddered slightly, and it was as if the tree were about to uproot itself and fly away. Ling Han was infuriated upon seeing this. He looked over only to see 6 people standing there. It was Xu Yaring and the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. They were truly like evil spirits that followed him around. Moreover, Ling Han's efforts had also been rendered futile by them. Not only that, but the fiery flame lightning strike would had even shown signs of fleeing. Ling Han wasn't opposed to competition. However, he sorely detested this kind of toxic competition. Not long ago, he had already killed Ma Lugong in a fit of rage. Now, these people were directly trampling on his bottom line. You're seeking death. Ling Han charged over in rage. Since they dared to interfere, they were naturally prepared to accept his wrath. Boom! Wings of flames unfurled behind Ling Han, and with a flap, he already arrived before Xu Yaring and the others. He drew his divine demon sword, and immediately unleashed the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Whoosh! Bursts of sword light blazed into the surroundings. Xu Yaring humphed as she replied with a palm strike. The others also unleashed their attacks. With Xu Yaring keeping Ling Han occupied, they could wantonly attack to their heart's content. So that's how you want it? Ling Han said with a cold chuckle. He activated his fire element divine fetus, immediately summoning a column of light from the sky. This column of light enveloped him, and it was impossible to describe the might that was radiating from this light. Damn it! Hurry up and retreat! Xu Yaring yelled in a frantic voice. She immediately shot back in retreat. Can you truly flee? Ling Han asked in a cold voice. He unleashed the full power of his divine fetus. Boom! With him as the center, a wave of flames swept into the surroundings. Like a roaring fire dragon, these flames instantly caught up to Xu Yaring and the others. This was the most powerful attack of his divine fetus. Even though Ling Han could only unleash one such attack in a short period of time, the might of this attack was truly astonishing. The wave of flames gradually died down, revealing Ling Han's figure. His hands were clasped behind his back, and only a single person remained standing before him. It was naturally Xu Yaring. However, she was also in a sorry state, and much of her clothing was already destroyed and in tatters, revealing much of her snow-white skin. In fact, one could even see glimpses of her behind, waist, and chest. However, numerous symbols flashed across her skin, and these symbols covered her body as if they were clothes. She was panting in exertion, and a lot of her silky black hair had already been singed. She no longer wore an expression of nobility and calm, and she instead appeared as disheveled as could be. As for the other 5 prodigies, they had all been exterminated. Xu Yaring threw her head back and roared at the sky. Her beautiful face was filled with wild rage. The wide prosperity heaven had initially been brimming with prodigies. However, many of them had been engulfed by Ji Wuming, and now more of them had been killed by Ling Han. Almost all of them were now dead. This caused her to feel wild with rage. This was a calamity for the wide prosperity heaven, and it would definitely take them countless years to recover this vitality. Naive Junior, you're actually showing such wanton disregard for the bigger picture, Xu Yaring said in a baleful voice. In her eyes, everything was for the sake of fighting against the storm of darkness. Thus, none of the top-notch prodigies could die. In fact, it would be best if they could all grow to become 9th heaven celestial kings. By slaughtering these prodigies, Ling Han was essentially slaughtering the future of the celestial realm. This caused Xu Yaring to boil with killing intent.